It's waiting to go live on YouTube.
It's loading. Yeah. Oh, here we
loading.
go. 5, 4. Okay, it's going.
All right, so we're live. Thank you very much, Lauren, for setting everything up technically. If you want to stay and be super positive, we'd welcome it.
I would love to. I have to go do other work, unfortunately.
Well, thanks a lot. All right. Well, I think we can get started. I first just want to say that I am over the moon to have all of you in one place today. Like I've been meeting with 7 of you like every other day for a semester, and then there's friends from near and far, close friends, far friends, California friends, Ohio friends, Nebraska friends. This is just awesome. So thank you all for being here. We're joined by Ashley Bigham, who is the founder of Outpost Office. I have a little read. I'm reading a little bit. She's also an assistant professor at The Ohio State University and will be featured in this year's Chicago Architecture Biennial. Maybe you'll tell us a little bit about that. And was last year's winner of the Ragdale Ring Competition, which was an amazing reaction to the conditions of COVID and kept an institution that's very near and dear to my heart alive. So I thank you all for that. And we also studied one of her houses from Outpost Office, which is a model sitting behind her right now. So if you guys need to change your projects in reaction to any newfound information that you have because of the presence of that model, please make those changes quickly. We are also joined by Grant Gibson, who's the founder of Kames Gibson, who is now a clinical associate professor. I'm just going to say it, clinical associate professor here at UIC. I just promoted him. He's building all sorts of amazing houses across the Midwest right now, including an amazingly too short of a house in Columbus, Indiana. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It is super relevant to all the low-res studies that we've been doing. And he's back from midterm, so he can tell us where we went wrong, where we went right, and school us on exactly what he meant and how we misinterpreted what he said. We're also joined by Zachary Tate Porter from Nebraska. Hi, Zach. He's doing amazing work there with both himself and his students. If you don't follow his Instagram, you should. We've actually, to embarrass you for a minute, we've probably looked at your Instagram more than any other precedent throughout the studio, and I'm embarrassed for you to see just how much we stole from you. I saw an amazing presentation of his at the ACSA conference that really blew me away, and then he told me how he did it, and I was still blown away. He was dissecting like everyday architecture, like gas stations and other sort of forgotten typologies, and reconfiguring them in really cool ways, both representationally cool, but also in other ways as well. And then finally, last but not least, Jimenez Lai, who came also at the request of Ashley because she wanted to, she studied one of your houses and wanted to make sure that you were at our final review. He teaches everywhere, including a summer studio by the Architectural Association in Los Angeles this summer. He's also the founder of Bureau Spectacular and a former professor here at UIC, so that explains why he was so chummy with Lauren Van Dam, the old Adrian. He is also an instigator of cartoonish architecture and an avid author, and has been thinking about topics that are really instrumental to the studio, and he's been thinking about them all for a very long time. So we're very, very lucky to have him and everyone else. So welcome, all of you. You will meet the students individually as they come up. But I'm going to dive into the presentation. You guys should have received a Miro link that will be the board from which we will be presenting today, and that houses some of the studio. I'm trying to set things up here. Studio work, background, and yeah, that's where we'll be. So if you want to follow along on your own, you can, but we will also be using it to do our presentations. The prompt started with an institution called the Wonder Museum. And I don't really know what our studio's relationship to this thing, other than it's kind of a subject of fascination. Not like all positive fascination, but maybe a little critical distance fascination. But it's an institution that is like a spectacle institution that calls itself a museum. So basically, it's a series of Instagrammable moments inside of a very nondescript building right near me in Chicago. So, you know, do you believe the chicken or the egg? You can put your own ball and vote. You know, so there's all sorts of moments where art and authorship are actually shifted onto the visitor to be able to practice their artistic practice and build their sort of social media brand. Housed as a kind of under the rubric of a museum in a building that really doesn't care about it, nor does it really care about the building, located fairly near the site of our project. So our program is also a museum, but it's not necessarily the Wonder Museum. And maybe this could be part of a conversation today, would be what our project relationship is to this thing. But it was certainly an instigator or a catalyst for some of the things that we were thinking about. The studio followed a pretty understandable, I think, trajectory moving on from this that questioned the role of resolution and authorship at various levels. So those two themes were underpinned a series of steps that got us to our building proposal, beginning with a study of the 44 low resolution houses, doing a architectural analysis of each one of them, and categorizing or doing an analysis of what we called their quirks and their features, which was how they purport to demonstrate authorship within a low res architecture. Then the next step after sort of learning from those 44 houses was to go to one of the highest resolution things we could find, which was high resolution scans of artworks from around the world and de-resolve them and combine them. So in Rhino, taking the 3D models, making them like dissolving them to just to the point of recognizability, and then getting multiples of them to coexist in the same space to kind of oscillate in ways that you couldn't quite tell if it was one or the other. You couldn't quite tell where it was or where it came from. And that's kind of the second column here, where each one of these has 3 to 5 different high resolution scans, and then uses certain techniques to de-resolve them and combine them in various capacities. And then the next step was to model these in some materials that were at hand, like construction paper or clay or Play-Doh, and produce a representational strategy, a physical representational strategy that could produce another level of investigation onto this purely formal one. So the next step was to take the techniques that were sort of discovered in these processes and taking them to a site. And our site is in the West Loop of Chicago. So if you're unfamiliar with it, it is just north of UIC and just west of the Loop of Chicago. And this site is surrounded on probably, I think, all 4, if not just 3 sides by a landmark district. And this landmark district has very strict rules about what you can and cannot build in order to stay within the character of the neighborhood. So it requires you to sort of understand the neighborhood history as a series of open air markets and buildings dedicated to that program. Here are some of those as they sit today, Starbucks, things like that. And there's just a number of these kind of, so there used to be like butchers and all sorts of food related warehouse, storage, processing, etc. And there are a series of buildings that are designated as contributing buildings to the character of the neighborhood that one should understand in order to be able to construct in this neighborhood and maintain that character. So our site is right here. So not technically part of the designated zone, but we wanted to be a good neighbor, and we wanted our building to kind of participate in the zeitgeist of fitting in. So what we did is we took those lessons of sort of sampling, de-resolving, and combining in particular ways to as a way of being contextual, of fitting in, of dealing with the sort of character of the neighborhood in the way that is being asked of in a report like this. And it began with modeling those buildings that were deemed important in very high resolution, and then de-resolving them both physically and in the computer to produce a building proposal on our site. Our site, it looks like this. We're looking west. There is an existing building that some students may keep, some students may not keep. The train line is just to the south. And the program is a 30,000 square foot museum program. There was a relatively vague program of exhibition spaces, back of house spaces, reception, all that kind of stuff, but not necessarily what kind of museum this is. Nor will the students really have a proposal of what kind of museum this is necessarily. Their project and process might yield more refined notions of what kind of museum it is, but in some cases the museum is left relatively ill-defined in service of playing out this process of sort of learning from the neighborhood, de-resolving it, and recombining things in a way that is just sort of reveals a notion of authorship without there being a kind of singular narrative to the configuration. So authorship, as I mentioned, was a kind of key underlying component, how we were kind of reacting to maybe some posturing by architects that operate in indifference or things like that, as if there is a kind of hands-off approach to legibility and the way that one would kind of read and understand the architecture. And instead, we didn't want to have such a kind of hands-off approach to that. Here's some early experiments at taking some of these, but substituting high resolution building parts and playing with them. However, students will not be presenting this necessarily. Instead, they're going to kind of dive right into their projects. This was more for background for your guys' sake to know where, if you see a vestige of this process, you kind of know where it comes from. But the students will be trying to make arguments that kind of stand on their own as building proposals. Any questions from any of the panelists or anything the students would like to add? We have 7 students. That means about 20 to 25 minutes per student. I don't suspect time will be much of an issue. I won't pay that close attention, but I would expect everyone to be able to get out of here 5 or a little bit after. Setting my timer up. All right, if there's no questions, we can start with Liam. You ready, Liam?
Just sent you request.
Yeah, I saw that. Let me get okay. Things started here.
All right. Thanks for coming, everyone. My name is Liam, and for this project, it's a collection of elements interpreted as the most essential conditions found in the Fulton Market neighborhood. And these boil down to bricks and window patterns. These conditions are mapped into basic formalizations, patties to reintroduce the droopiness of clay material, and gridded jittery window patterns to reference multiple types of neighboring window facades. The elements come together and meet at the corners, producing subtraction through combination. The patties rest on top of and are squished beneath the building volumes, activating a unique physics between the elements. They are solid, decorative blobs dependent upon other volumes to maintain consistency with the objects within the gallery spaces. The largest brick blob resting on the ground supports the longer building volume resting on top of it, producing a gentle slope to the floors of the interior gallery space. And the slight irregularities in the window alignment produces a sense of movement and inviting perspective to visitors. The objects occupying the gallery spaces are grouped into interdependent collections at various scales. These objects sit on a spectrum of recognizability, some being immediately recognizable and others being more abstract. The qualities which make them stand out are scale, groupings, and level of recognition. And they sit on a continuum of scale and display, starting with the building itself and ranging down to person-sized and handheld. The interactions people have with the objects depends upon their own experiences and their movement around them. There are second and third floor cutouts in the floors, matching the size of coffers in the ceilings. These produce windows in the floor to view other spaces, and some of these cutouts are covered with glass, while others are glass boxes or pedestals protruding up from the floor. These pedestals are ambiguous as they blend in with other objects within the gallery. If you look on the right side of my feed, you can see the section and plans for each level. The fourth floor has offices, administration, mechanical equipment. The third floor is gallery space. The second floor is a much larger gallery space. The first floor consists of a reception area, coat check, a gift shop, and a feature gallery. And then the basement or the lower level houses a kitchen for the outdoor dining area, as well as storage and back of house areas. So some of the objects on the site depend on others, while some are more independent. The designed dependence throughout the project is meant to unify and create a path through the space. The buildings and the brick blobs depend on one another, and the objects inside galleries depend on the groups of which they are a part. The object dependencies and the physical interactions between the objects offers a range of specificity and recognition. The lower resolution elements recede to highlight the more specific items, while the materials used for some of the lower resolution items places them higher on the recognition spectrum. This range of low resolution, interdependent objects, specificity, and recognition all make the project a referential and sensory experience for visitors. Thank you.
This notion of the brick patty is interesting in the way in which you've deployed it. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how, either about its resolution materially at the kind of the scale of how one approaches it on the street, or maybe how it performs. Am I meant to engage with it in any way as I'm walking down the sidewalk? I'm thinking particularly about the one at the ground level. Can you talk more about how it operates there in the urban context?
Well, I debated throughout the semester about how to have them be, something people could interact with, whether they be hollow or the material. But I think seeing bricks de-resolved into a squishy like shape would be an interesting and sort of unexpected interruption to this urban context.
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity there. In some ways, it reminds me of about how Tom Wiscombe talks about ground objects the notion that there is a project around the building mass itself, and then there's the literal ground of the city, and then there is this intermediate kind of object that belongs to the ground, which we could kind of think about as a plinth or as a podium, or as in some cases, Tom Wiscombe talks about a whole operating in the same way. And other people have written about that kind of urban gesture dealing with the ground. I think about Pier Vittorio Aureli's writing on Mises plinths, and how that separates you in a way from the city and allows you to kind of see the city as something different than the space of architecture. And so I think, really, especially the one that is on the street level, that kind of produces a different ground condition than the street, becomes an opportunity to think about how it could perform and change the relationship of that urban setting. Particularly this question about, is it a private space that belongs to the institution of the museum, or is it a public space that belongs to the city? That seems to be a critical question to unpack through the articulation of that brick.
Liam, are you suggesting it's actually squishy?
No, but the shape of it would resemble a patty.
And what would its materiality actually be? Maybe not a material, but is it hard? It's hard or soft or rubbery or?
It would be hard. I think, at least that's how I'm imagining it to be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that adds a whole other dimension to it, I think, which is then the expectation versus the reality. So there's one, which is like, we're not expecting bricks to be in this shape. So that's kind of one expectation meeting reality, but all of that happens with the first glance at it, right? In the first image we have of it, we see that, okay, bricks are not supposed to be droopy and floppy, but that would be a kind of second reveal, right? As if I'm moving closer to it. If I think about like the some of the Jeff Koons, which look like inflatable pool toys or something, right? But they're actually very hard and brittle. And so that could be, it's a kind of second reveal. And so I'm just wondering, like, that kind of second reveal to me also appears to be happening with the windows. So I think you called them windows, but in none of the renderings do they look like windows. They actually look like applied materials on top of the building. And again, that I don't know if that is a representational thing, or is that a kind of another moment where you are taking an expectation and a pattern, and then it's only through a kind of close inspection, a close as in physical, or close as in close reading, that there are certain ways that the audience might be able to uncover something about the building that, again, is contextual, but not contextual in the same way. Can you tell me about those windows? Is that just, are they real are they actually windows?
They are, yeah, and they're inspired by all of the glass brick grids from the neighborhood.
Is the idea that the color would actually be, like, the glass would be the color, or it's only a representation? The glass would be colored.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I would actually want to see it detailed out where also the glass appears to be applied onto the frame, right? So you're also kind of maybe playing there with this Chicago frame idea of the way that the glass would typically relate to the frame. And so here it's kind of stuck on the outside. So I think those are some really exciting and promising points, I think, of the way that you're dealing with materiality in the project. And yeah, I would probably want to just see some details of that in a further in the studio, but this is not something that you needed to do in this studio at all, but it would be such an interesting project, almost for like an integration studio.
I really liked actually asking about the actual materiality, because I'm also wondering about that too. And I there's a part of me that wants to talk about the Byzantium project from OMA. It's a really early OMA project, one of the earliest, actually. It's one of these, it was really badly received at the time when it's so badly received that on OMA's website, they don't even show it anymore. Yeah, exactly. If you go to their own website, they only show representations of the project. But Byzantium, yeah, you'll see, there you go, the Flickr link or something. Yeah, it's kind of like a right on their own website. They show this super wonderful collage sort of elevation, really gorgeous, fantastic. You know, in fact, I think there's quite a bit of similarity between your let's say base block, but then it's this kind of disk-like addition to the base block that I'm thinking about. Can we look at the actual photograph, because that thing is built? What I find interesting is that OMA doesn't show the built work for once. No, you'll have to go to another website to see the built work, because OMA seems to also be a little embarrassed. There you go. Yeah, you just smelled. Yep, there it is. It was so badly received, you know, structurally, maybe. I think, you know, maybe coming back to Ashley's point, you know, the representational aspirations versus the material logic. Even though I get that in this studio, that might not be the point. But if there's an, let's say, easy connection to make between the rhetorical versus the, let's say, plausible, it suddenly makes the project, I guess, propels it into a different conversation in my mind. But maybe, Stuart, you also got to stop me if I'm not, you know, talking about it in ways that you want us to. Like, I think I would assume that you want to have a different type of conversation than plausibility or feasibility. I mean, no one said this yet, so I'll say it. This is really beautiful. Like, your work is super fantastic. You know, I think everyone probably agrees, and they just take it for granted that they don't have to tell you. But it's really, really wonderful, the work. And you know, I think these kinds of for me, the thing that I want to talk about the most would be the patties relationship with the base blocks, right? Like, how do you jut into the base blocks? Like, are there moments of displacement? Well, I guess you're not displacing anything, you're just placing it onto things. Okay, there's no displacement, got it. But I think, but also the base blocks in themselves, these kinds of very subtle rotations, you know, whether you were looking at Lucan or Moss, you know, I think these subtle rotations are super interesting, particularly in plan, when you spatially produce these kinds of contractive moments that open up to these kinds of expansive moments on both ends. I find that to be a really nice move. I mean, it kind of like maybe gets overshadowed by the funny brick pillows, but I think architecturally they're interesting moves that you've also made in addition to the brick patties. But before I just stop, one thing, I mean, because I'm still really struck by Ashley's question about materiality. You said hard. Do you foresee this being something that, I mean, I'm just thinking about the construction logic of something like this. It's probably something that does get aggregated. You probably do need to sand it down somehow, you know, on a large scale. Like, as far as a conversation about simulacrum goes, you know, like, I think where are we in the material expression of something that is trying to communicate what it's not, right? Like, I feel like that's kind of one discussion that I'm curious to hear from you, but also perhaps Stuart.
Well, you know, we didn't really start to think about, you know, realistic materials for actual construction. And I suppose I imagined them as being hard just because I wanted to reference bricks from the rest of the neighborhood. But the, you know, a material that is trying to show something it's not is interesting, something I'm thinking more about now.
I think Jimena is like, from my perspective, the this studio has a lot of pressures on it. And I would say that we tried to treat these as plausibly as possible, while at the same time being as truthful to things that we thought had a lot of promise as possible. So we really did build these up in a pretty bottom up strategy of like, okay, we think this, okay, we think we know why this is good. Then do this. We think we know why this is good. And then he started to make building elements using this as a strategy. And that's why you're getting layered on windows, because he built like he built a contour line, and he was trying to do that. And we thought this was good. Like oops, he didn't lock it. We made these and we're like, oh my God, those are amazing. We think that there's a lot of promise architecturally for what those are. We don't know what they are. So we spent a lot of midterm like talking, like, so Liam brought up the word physics, like figuring out what the right way to treat these as serious was. And I think you're right to say that they're caught in that process, right? Where if we were to take this serious and it was fiberglass, that would suck, right? Like that would not be a good thing. It's also extremely close to Kapoor and Herzog and de Meuron's squished shiny thing underneath a skyscraper in New York. So clearly the material, like, I'm barring whether that's good or bad, you know, the materiality of this one is extremely different, and it's reflective of its neighborhood, not literally reflective in the same way that that one is, but this one is a little bit different, right? So there is a dialogue there that probably has a materiality or an execution that's better, one step up from a fiberglass like giant cow in the landscape or something, you know. So like, I think you're right, it's caught, but at the same time we were trying to be earnest, and like we were trying to be earnest and serious about things that didn't want to be treated that way, and you're right to sense a kind of tension there.
I mean, in a weird way, it's, I mean, completely plausible and believable, which I think is like something that's great about the project, which is that, you know, each one of those patties is, could be solving a real architectural problem, as well as doing all of the aesthetic things that we're excited about here. The one on the roof, you know, is covering up all the air handling units and the junk, and you know, it would just have like a lot of little vents coming out of it at the top. But you know, like there always has to be stuff on top of the building, and it never looks good, right? And so, like, again, to use these kind of inflatable forms and shapes to actually sort of hide the structure at the bottom, or to hide some mechanical equipment at the top. I don't, again, that's not why you did it. And that's the correct train of thought, right? It's like you do it for the aesthetic reasons first, and like the investigation of form first that you guys were working on the studio. But then, yeah, if you really took this further, it could actually be really great for all kinds of practical reasons. And I think like that's a sign of a really successful architectural project often. It's very gorgeous. I agree.
Thank you so much.
Sometimes we forget to say that. It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
The thing that I'm curious about, I mean, I always like the brick patties too, but they always felt like a disconnected joke, or like an opening joke that just kind of warms the crowd up, and then you go about the business of the project. And I guess the reason they feel that way to me is because of the totally different sensibility of materiality that the rest of the project has. Like the rest of the project is not really interested in material, it's interested in light and color. And I don't mind that disconnect, but I want you to be able to explain that, or acknowledge that and be able to explain that. It's like material doesn't matter except at this one moment with this one element. And then that, because that element is foreign to the rest of the sensibility of the project, something is gained from it. But I guess like I'm still kind of struggling, like the gut reaction to use those brick patties as ways to either, I don't know, accommodate the stuff we don't want in architecture, or to put special spaces inside them, which was, I think, my gut reaction at midterm. is like find a way to carve them out and put something in there, some cool space. Like both of those feel inadequate to what they are doing in terms of the massing. So then I'm trying to figure out like is there a third option? If we have mass that is in a way, and it's playing formal rules, but it's not playing spatial rules in the project. And I'm wondering if that's an issue and whether or not that can be acceptable. And I mean, that's not a question for you. It's just a general question that I generally don't understand whether or not that's good or bad, or why it would be good or bad at this given moment in time and the kind of work that people collectively are interested in. Yeah. I mean, I find like the basement in your project is like that one section where we see the basement, like that seems so strange to me. And like, I think that could be really novel. This idea that you tilt the building up, you put a space underneath the tilted up space, but then it doesn't acknowledge the gap between. Like, that just seems really weird. And it seems like that should be, like the gut would be to take out the floor or the ground in that section and somehow allow the ceiling of the basement to be all one space underneath here. But that's not, that seems too easy and it seems too conventional, and it just automatically does that second option of using some really great formal attribute that's in the massing of the project to then create some unique space within inside the project. And I think that seems not in the spirit of what the patties are. I don't know if that makes any sense. The other thing that I find like really interesting about the project and plan is that there's like, you do all this work to produce this really amazing grid in the elevation and the section, and the patty is a foil to the kind of grid logic of the facade and this, and how the entire building is organized from the outside. And then you, like, one would assume then that we would see structure that follows the grid, and you say, no, there's not going to be structure at all. Like I'm going to produce a grid, I'm going to use the grid to organize the project, but I will not put any structure in it. So the grid can only be only facade. It can only be at the limit of the project. And then when you put any sort of partition inside the project, it automatically seems ignorant to the logic of the grid, right? Like the partitions and some of the plans are just here, there, and everywhere. Like that seems really great to me. Like the idea that you're going to put all this rigid logic into the perimeter and then ignore it in the middle, and we get kind of weird, funny objects and props throughout the project. But I wonder if those two things could be related somehow. The idea that these patties don't play a spatial role in the logic of the project, and then the interior elements are just deployables that can just be kind of scattered about here and there. And I wonder if there's some way that those two things can be connected.
I had a similar thought on the absence of structure, and I think it's connected to the way in which the window operates as this applied component, which in many ways subverts the whole logic of where it comes from in the Chicago frame. The idea that the structural frame is the kind of most important thing, and the window is just the void left over. And so to invert that and have the window as the object, it then makes sense that the frame kind of disappears, and we see the window doing other things beyond being a reflection of the structural system. And those other things, I think, have to do with this notion of scale and resolution, the fact that these purple windows are so much bigger than the pink ones, and you get two of the purple windows in the big double height space, but two of the pink windows in the smaller height space. So I think there is all of these layers of subtlety as you get into the project and look beyond some of the more obvious moves, which are fun and playful. But I think there's a really subtle layer as well to the way in which the project responds to its context. That's quite successful.
All right. Well, thank you. That was a great conversation. You guys brought up a lot of things that we hadn't really considered and brought in lots of different perspectives on that. I really like the conversation too about the Chicago frame reaction. I think that could be a really useful conversation connection throughout the day, because the grid and things and windows and things will kind of come up. And yeah, so happy to put a pin in that as we move on to our next presenter. Thanks so much, Liam.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Welcome. My name is Ashley Parker, and thank you so much for coming today to our review. Let's see if I can make this. There we go. Okay. For this project, I explored the Fulton Market and was really taken by the character of the trim on the neighborhood buildings, which is unique to each building, fanciful and symmetrical. I was also fascinated with the windows, which are often large and neatly positioned together in a tight grid. I took those elements and exaggerated them in scale and in number and disrupted their position by shifting them away from normalcy. This produces a kind of near normal fit.
Oh,
Thank you, Stuart. Okay.
yeah.
The trim became these oversized and inhabitable slabs that slip over 3 permeated boxes nestled into the ground plan. And the slabs and windows are all loose in their fitting, which gives an overall destabilizing effect. Through this disruption, I took the opportunity to challenge ideas of interiority and exteriority. For example, someone can be inside a slab. Someone can be inside a slab. There we go. They can be inside a slab or outside of the slab, but in the same vertical line. So someone can be inside the slab, but then also be suspended over the space of the neighborhood. In contrast, someone can be in the most inner sanctum of the building, but be able to look out and move about in the neighborhood. I'm sorry, that's not quite as centered as I hoped. Outside, you're visually connected to the surrounding, but compressed between the heavy slabs above and below. As you move inward one layer, you're further compressed between the slab and the perforated wall, which is restricting views to the inside only. On moving through the inner layer to the central space, one can see back through the wall to the slabs and the activities of the inhabitants. Light here is also limited, which is a necessary condition for most museums at one place or the other. And from the central space itself, this shifted orientation of the slabs and their irregular fitting into the wall is really showcased. And in some cases, visual access is also allowed back to the neighborhood. Each layer of the interiority then has a different sensibility about visual and spatial connection to the neighborhood. This setup organizes the circulation into a perimeter pathway that encircles the central program. Hard surfaces ring the outer perimeter, while internally there's a perforated surface. At some levels, such as this floor, 5th floor, there's barely any sectional separation between inner and outer layers. Someone's allowed to move between the boxes on the interior through the windows that are large enough to be doorways out into the slabs to see the neighborhood. But as you experience other levels, your access is contained by the perimeter of the slab walls. Furthermore, if you move upward in plan, this containment of the slab becomes stronger. So this concept of interior and exterior was challenged in more ways than one this semester. As you know, we were restricted to being at home, where our living spaces became our workspaces. Things from the outside are mixed with things from the inside. Here's my kitchen with my things from school, my living things, food, they're all sort of mixed together. And you can see here that the interior is exposed, showing these slightly shifted floor plates and shifting slab, all tethered around a consistent center. So in conclusion, this methodology of appropriation, exaggeration, and a loose fit presented many opportunities for layering interiority that challenges notions of spatial separation. Thank you.
Ashley, while we kind of just browse through this, Can you explain the articulation on the underside of the red trays? Like in elevation, it seems like there's essentially the subtraction of where I would assume beams would be or something. Like I'm not sure what these little, I don't know, what these little notches are that disappear here or there.
Oh, those are the oversized trim.
Okay.
So you can see sort of like an enlargement of a small section from the trim in different places.
But you don't do that on the top. Like the top stays a clean line, whether it's sloped or angled, it stays clean. You only keep the articulation of the brick edge on the bottom side.
That's a good question. I wanted there to be, again, that conversation about sort of near normal. And so on the underside of some of the trim, it's sort of flat where it meets the rest of the brick. So that was a decision at one point to keep it contained from being on both sides.
Ashley, could you just help me by redefining what you mean by near normal?
Well, so it's a little bit about fit and then also about scale. So trim is habitable, but it's still in some ways looks like trim. It's just scaled up and shifted. Windows are almost in a grid, but not quite. They're just shifted ever so slightly. And then the floor, the slabs, which are almost straight, are not quite straight. So it's this play on crookedness and shifting.
I think the network was, I don't know if it was my end or
It was hers.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so near normal is, you know, a normal scale and then exaggerated or shifted from almost not imperceivably so. But, a straight window
I mean, if I may if I may chime in, my internet is a little stronger.
Thank you.
I mean, I think it has multiple meanings. Like, I think in one way it's about recognizability, and in another way it might be about that idea that Ashley brought up before about expectation versus reality. So maybe from 100 feet away it fully meets our expectations versus from 5 feet away there's something off about it. So I think the near normal has to do with, like, I can see that looks like trim, or there is a kind of association, but it's not. And then there's this other way of it being regular but slightly off.
Like, are we discovering an acceptable range of rotation? Like, if something's off by a few degrees, or, you know, if the position of the window is you know, deliberately misregistering by a few, you know, inches or feet, I'm kind of curious about the range, you know, like, and in a way, I'm even imagining some kind of explorative drawings that superimpose and collapse a bunch of ranges, almost like an X-ray drawing of, kind of like that dinner table drawing that everybody seemed to be really obsessed with. But this time, you know, it's really the kind of wobbly, you know, like ghosted edge condition of how, like, beyond what point does it no longer, you know, is it no longer within any proximity to normal, and at what edge, you know, can it still be almost normal? I'm kind of curious about. I mean, I feel like that could be a super compelling drawing. I'm just imagining it right now, but
Yeah, I have.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I have some like construction paper work that we did earlier in the semester. And that was really compelling and fun. And then I got it into model space, and there was definitely a range. There was
Yeah.
a crazy that I kind of had to scale it back from there. I initially had the windows really wild as well. I sort of had to aim it back into like 5 degrees rotation. Also the floors, the inner floors of the slabs were, it couldn't be too crazy because it wouldn't be accessible to people, but it does kind of create a ramp, so I made it a little bit more gentle.
Yeah, I mean, this might be like for I don't know in the room, maybe Grant has the most experience, but you know, I was talking to the contractor about that desert house when I was still working on it. But even in the desert, you know, they were recommending a very slight kind of rotation to the roof. Like, it's so gradual, but then, you know, it's obviously for drainage reasons, right? It's obviously, I mean, so a flat roof is in fact always crooked, always, for drainage reasons. And I'm just thinking, you know, like if in Ashley's work, the moment that something gets bent beyond the point of no return, like, you know, can you deem something not normal enough? Is, you know, I'm just thinking about the kind of yeses and nos, where the violations, where the acceptances of what can be considered normal. And I'm also assuming that part of this exploration is to identify maybe the eeriness of almost normal. You know, like, I think at this point, I think the uncanny valley is within everyone's vocabulary, and there's something about the almost normal that freaks everyone out, right? And I'm wondering if it's that range, that, you know, is it almost normal to a point where it's pleasant, or, you know, it's almost normal to a point where it's scary.
Yeah. Stuart, could you take us to that interior that is double, triple height? Yeah, so you can kind of see that there's like almost, you know, that disorder where people get freaked out by holes? It has a little bit of that quality.
That is so gross.
I don't have that.
Don't
What's the name of it, Ashley? What's the name of that disorder?
That's what it kind of reminds me of. Yeah, this isn't really where
I can see it now. Yeah, that's scary. Yeah.
But there is a little bit of there's a skewedness, and there's the kind of a roughness to it that I got from working with the construction paper. So that I left the windows like that. Thank you, Emily. Yeah. To kind of keep it, you know, low resolution, for lack of a better word.
I think this kind of notion of the range or the tolerances around the near normal that Jimenez is bringing up is really interesting, compelling as a way to think about the project. Actually, I'm wondering if you thought about that primarily from like this exterior perspective vantage point, or from the interior, because they both have kind of references to a familiarity, but also both disturb that familiarity. And do you see one as being more near normal than another? Were you thinking about it primarily from the interior or the exterior?
I started first with the exterior, and then when I got to the inside, it kind of opened itself up to a lot of different conversations, like how the floor plates would fit into the slabs, and then how the windows would fit back into the slabs and into the floor plates. Do I, you know, do I cut a window in half with a floor, or does everything need to be flush? So I think that it extended itself to the inside because I found that there was these opportunities for kind of weirdness, like on this picture on the right, you know, those are just like windows for your feet. I mean, so there's some weirdness there that happens. There's weirdness where the slabs sort of cut through the windows as well. And then other times where they just line up really nicely. So I think it started first with the outside and then extended to the inside. And I tried to take advantage of it when it happened on the inside.
There's this other tension that's happening. I think that's very similar in its behavior to what you just described, but happening in the massing. So in the massing, it's kind of torn between being this stack project, like a kind of Jennifer Bonner sandwich, or an Olgiati, the kind of the Russian museum proposal that Olgiati did with all the tiers, the kind of wedding cake tiers at different scales, or it's a nesting project. So it's the O.A. Munger's Frankfurt Museum or the Stuttgart Public Library. So it's like these kind of a house in a box, or a box in a box, or a this and a that, because I thought it was a stack, and then in your animation it seems to be a nesting project. And I've been trying to just think about if it should resolve itself into one of those, if it's good that the tension is there between and that it's kind of fighting, and so then, like, again, it is that friction between the two forms that's always kind of playing off of each other. But it's not also, or it seems to not only be, it's not that kind of the red is doing the stacking work and the white is doing the nesting work. It's actually possibly a little bit messier than that. And so these are kind of the formal games that I'm trying to wrestle with. And hopefully that was all part of your plan, is that this friction between the two formal systems that you're using in the massing. It's hard to have a project where the form is kind of fighting itself so in such opposition, but I think it's working really well for you. It seems to be, anyway.
Thank you.
Would you say that that's a accurate read of the project? Like, is that something you were actively kind of working with?
Well, initially we thought to clear out the slabs. And, you know, just have this kind of peekaboo situation with the windows in between the slabs. But then we kind of just kept talking, and, you know, everything's collaborative. And so one of our students, Colin, was like, why don't you just like leave it on the inside, leave the box in the inside. And so then it was, you know, some movement there. And then I wrestled with it because I, of course, had ideas about how, you know, but then I think that's part of the game too, is to be a little bit flexible when things come up, and then you weigh it.
But the section at the very bottom, if we look at that, like, that's the moment where, you know, I think some of the super successful moments are the roof terrace, where the red is actually then coming into the zone of the white, right? And so, you know, I'm curious now, why does the red floor never come into the project, right? Like, because that would be this real kind of, that would really get the friction going between, is it nesting or is it stacking, right? To have stacked elements that are coming in, but it really holds to those white walls, and everything that's on the interior of the white walls becomes white, right? And becomes part of that diagram. And I'm just curious, like, what how far you could really push that tension if some of those slabs were actually red slabs, right? Diagrammatically, formally.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think we talked about layering. And so there's this kind of what you brought up earlier about expectations. You know, there's expectations that the inside of the slabs would be clear and you just walk around in them, maybe. Or, I mean, you wouldn't expect anything from them, and then you would be surprised. But then there's sort of another kind of weird thing happens, in which there's actually layers within the slabs and within actually layers only within the slabs. So I think that it kind of becomes a jawbreaker then almost in some places where you're sort of going through to get to the center, but not having to do that in other areas, which is kind of interesting that it's only happening in certain places. But I think that is that is a really interesting thing to think about sort of keeping the slabs as they are on the inside.
I find it fascinating how different that other section reads than the rendered version. And part of it's because we don't get this coding of the different systems through red and white. So in the section that's more of a line drawing, there's much more ambiguity in terms of which wall or floor belongs to which system. And there might be something valuable in that, and thinking about, is the red literal meant to be a different material in the project, or did it get you to a certain point and now the kind of blurring or the making that more ambiguous in one version of the proposal could potentially add another layer to how those two systems come together. So I think there's something here that reads very differently just through its representational system than in the rendered version. Were you thinking of the red and white as being literal material differences?
Nope, just at least in my mind, I thought of them as a similar material. Yeah, I think ambiguity is something that I played with from the very beginning, where I had sort of a banana and a torus shape that had a happy marriage. And if you were to experience that in real life, you'd walk around it and be like, this is a cylindrical or spherical donut shape, but then you get to a certain part and you're like, oh, it's a banana. So I like that misreading. Did I break up? I might have broken up.
You're fine.
I'm dropping a story in the chat space. This came from several years ago when Xi Jinping from Beijing declared that there should be no more weird architecture in China. I don't know if you remember this story. And I'm just thinking about the antithesis of weird and the possibility of a kind of cultural achievement of normalcy, right? And I think I'm imagining if your project gets built if Xi Jinping was a critic on this panel, he might say stuff like, no, this is still weird, right? I'm just thinking about the comfort level of, it's such an interesting question to ask, like at what point is something normal? And I've been grappling it throughout the entire review of your work. I mean, obviously for someone like Philippe Dujardin, the Belgian collage artist, he takes these kinds of hyper-realistic, culturally normal Flemish, brick facades, and he restitches them back together in a nearly impossible way, a structurally, questionable way, and we do a double take because something is almost not normal, since we do recognize a lot of elements that are normal, and I'm thinking about your work in that context, the qualification of weird or normal, or maybe even establishing the benchmark of what is considered normal. Like normal is a really heavy word, right? Like I think normal, given time and space and geography, I think what's normal here may not be normal somewhere else. What's normal here now may not be so normal here in the past, and I think if one of the ways that I'm thinking about how you write about this project or talk about this project moving forward could be first establishing a baseline of what you deem to be normal. Like I think maybe normal angles seem to be one of the things that you want to talk about, or normal cores seem to be one of the things that you talk about, or normal structural assembly, normal plates, that also might be one of the things. So I feel like I was struggling at the beginning because I was looking for more definitions of the status of normalcy that you're trying to establish.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
All right, that's time. I think you guys really, again, kind of targeted the real questions of the project, both normal as well as the conversation about stacked versus nested. Like I think that those were very driving questions throughout the semester, and I think the conversation really targeted that very carefully. Thank you so much, Ashley.
Thank you.
Next one. If you like normal, and you're not gonna like this one.
Oh no.
Okay.
Hi everyone. My name is Rizna. First, thank you so much for coming to our review.
Oh wait, it's loading.
What? Oh, okay. So for this project, I looked at the incessant modularity based on the Chicago block size present in most of Chicago, the West Loop neighborhood, and our site. In order to develop a design strategy for myself, I use my child's Legos, which exhibit the similar incessant modularity. These Legos become the co-organizational element in the building, but it is not visible as it happens inside out. It is plastered over by another childhood favorite, Play-Doh, which disguises the sharp ends of the Lego blocks. Thereby, a de-resolved arch form is created for the neighborhood.
Is it not going?
Nope. So the entire building sits at an angle that allows it to be read better as one walks past it. The slight pinch, see what it's not like.
Here, hold up.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, it works now.
Yeah. The slight pinch of the Play-Doh in the middle creates an inviting entrance into the museum. Power poles on site are used to derive landscape elements that create opportunities for interaction before one walks through them to enter the museum. Only when one enters inside, they notice the jagged interior with the columns registering some intersections. The Play-Doh sometimes comes to the interior where there are double height spaces. These spaces break up the regularity of the flow slabs. So for plans, the 5th level has dining with a mezzanine and a kitchen. The gallery spaces take up the first floor levels with a shared space for gallery and gift shop. The modularity of the Lego blocks informs these spaces and program inside. Each floor plan is different, with the Lego blocks pushing through against the Play-Doh as if to hold it back from entering the spaces like a retaining wall. Different arrangements of the blocks on each floor create different spaces. Yeah, so you can see even like the walls, the edges are completely different from plans to plan. This is the view of the gallery from the front desk. And this is one of the double height spaces as viewed on the 3rd level. So even the columns, they act like when viewed like from this front view, they actually are like a framing element too. And this is from the 5th level where you can see the blocks on the ceiling holding back the Play-Doh. This is a window, and so some blocks that are stacked, they have their edges that like they meet outside the Play-Doh. So these are actually trimmed off, which to create windows, which appear as slits on the elevation. So that's why the windows have like different widths.
So you can see it like in the plan, the way right, isn't it?
Yes. So on plan, like where like that was supposed to be an edge that meets outside the Play-Doh. So that is actually trimmed off, and a window is put in.
Resna, can we please not use the word Play-Doh or Legos anymore? Like after the full image, like it's so clear. I don't think you should use it anymore. And it kind of undermines
Okay.
how beautiful the work is once you get past the initial video. Like for me, like the poche space around the perimeter, is that like solid mass?
Yes,
And it's, I mean, who knows what it is, but it's solid, right?
it's solid, yes. I'm treating the walls actually like a retaining wall. So that's how I was looking at it. So like something with a mass and the walls are like pushing back against it.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason I think like talking about Play-Doh and Legos, once you get past the initial diagram, is of no value.
Yeah.
Like this is so heavy, not just like physically, but like in terms of its presence and like the separation you're producing between inside and outside. It's a castle. And I think that that comes with tones and so essentially references that gets past the toy references. And I think that that type of architecture that's dealing with mass and it has very clear distinctions between inside and outside and uses poche as the ways in which it's composed. For me, that in contrast to the color palette and the way you're thinking about materiality and the lighting that you're producing and in both these kind of exterior views, but especially those interior shots, I think like that's the project for me, or that's the real architectural proposition that you're putting forward, is that you're using a very, very old notion of architecture that's just dealing with mass. And you're trying to do that with a sensibility that feels very much of this moment. And I think that like that gets you past Play-Doh and Legos in a good way.
Yeah, despite the, I mean, beautiful project, despite the kind of very atypical form of the building, it seems like a building that is pretty perfect for brick, which is one of the most typical materials in Chicago around what you guys have been discussing and looking at the neighborhood and thinking about some of your classmates' work so far. Maybe it's also the kind of pinkish, reddish colors that you're using here, but I'm just imagining maybe also the Monadnock building is stuck in my head because Stuart and I took a tour of it together once. But you know, there's something about the kind of thick heaviness that I'm starting to think about it, and these and you mentioned it well. Again, not as Play-Doh. I think, yeah, Grant's really right about that. Please don't, yeah, find an architectural term. So there's poche, or there's like mass, or again, there might be a term that you invent that's, you know, quasi-architectural that would kind of help think about it. Or there may be a kind of literal skin that you're thinking about, like, is it a particular material? And I guess that's why I'm just kind of defaulting to that kind of classic brick, because I think if you had to figure out how the pattern, and again, maybe I'm sort of, thinking about the first project a little bit, Liam's like the kind of squishy, droopy brick, and yours is going to be this kind of tube, right? It's like this rounded tube. And I'm thinking, okay, is it something that again is kind of stacked up and layered from top to bottom, like you're icing a cake and you go up? Or is it something that is a kind of tube that's bent over? And so then the brick pattern would run in this direction, right? So it's kind of a tube that's then bent over. And I think that would kind of help me understand too, just the overall form, because I mean, it's very clear what you're calling Lego and Play-Doh, like the, let's call it like volume and skin, or volume and poche, or volume and thickness right now. I understand the relationship between those, but that relationship in and of itself doesn't quite get me to how it came to be this kind of almost like a pair of pants sort of shape, right? like that doesn't tell me why it has legs, which is okay, but I'm looking maybe for like that like next level of articulation to tell me like a little bit more about that genesis of like how it got to be this really kind of atypical form, which I'm super excited about. But yeah, I think like more specificity between those two things would help us understand that.
I was
Yeah.
looking at it as, oh, sorry, was anyone talking?
Please go ahead.
Oh, okay, thank you. I was looking at it as a de-resolved arch because I noticed like when I went on the site, there were a lot of arches and I wanted to like incorporate that. So yeah, so like,
Okay.
I mean, yes, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, maybe you said that in the presentation and I was probably just distracted by the drawings, but but yeah, no, yeah, the arch is clear, but since it's not an arch you can walk through, it loses some of that arch quality, right? So if
Yes.
there's that kind of definition of an arch, it's usually that there's some sort of space in there. And so like
Yeah.
you see the form of the arch, but then once you squish it together, it's like it presents itself a little less archness.
I think Ashley, your question about the brick stack, like, cause so RISNA has thought about it in both ways at various stages, like in the same way that I think Ashley had thought about it either as nesting or as stacking, and then kind of like tried to bring them together. RISNA both had like a tube that was bent versus a kind of stacked up thing. And I think like the conversation about the way you're talking about bricks, maybe registering both at the same time, but like more explicitly that's kind of at the forefront maybe of how you're thinking about it, and the ambiguity of those two readings still being present, I think could be really great. Sorry, Jimenez.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, no, I think brick is definitely one way of thinking about this. But I was also thinking about some other ways of maybe replace the word Play-Doh, but also thinking about like what else is this project kind of questioning with regards to the status of something else. I'm thinking about, you know, let's say Adobe construction or mud construction, you know. When my office worked on the Coachella project, there was this kind of doubly curved surface that's luckily on the back side of the building that didn't get really photographed by a lot of people. But you know, no matter how good the craftsman, the doubly curved surface, we couldn't get because the logic was basically stucco, right? It was basically stucco, and they couldn't get it to become very smooth at that scale, and so. It's almost as though somebody went through a rapid weight loss process and the skin just looked really, I don't know if there's a technical term for that, and it was almost inescapable. Once I saw that, I almost can't unsee it. And every time I would drive through, let's say, New Mexico or through Santa Fe, for example, I see it everywhere, right? It's a type of surface, it's a surface texture that's, you know, always lumpy, always imperfect. It takes so much work to, you know, get it to become smooth. You almost don't need it to be smooth. You kind of just embrace it for the lumpiness. I don't know. And I'm thinking about your project in that context, right? Like, I think, like, is this a Frank Gehry project where you precisely, you know, make these kinds of pleats and folds in such a way that the location of the window is exactly panelized just the way that we would do apply a kind of brick logic, or could this be, you know, an oversized mud / Adobe construction logic where you kind of aggregate a lot of, you know, additional material? So it's not so much of a definitive comment. It's more so of a, you know, like internal question that your project sparked for me. Just thinking, you know, this is a type of surface condition that's everywhere, and, you know, does your project help us ask that question again?
Yeah, I think both of these notions of materiality that we're imagining on the project would make it more low res, whether it's the kind of stucco Adobe, or you can imagine almost kind of shotcrete, where you're really embracing the roughness of it as an approximated form, or the brick, which becomes like a pixel that would start to make some of these edges maybe not so smooth and curved, but have a kind of fuzziness to it, which could be quite interesting. I think the way in which you're cutting the windows also is a fascinating thing to think about relative to some of the historical projects that have been mentioned, like the Monadnock. The thing about the Monadnock is not only that you can see the poche and its crazy thickness in plan, but when they cut a window, right, you can see the thickness of that wall there. Whereas it seems like every window you cut, you do it at the thinnest edge. So we don't ever really, there's a few moments where we kind of get a sense of the thickness, but most of the time that outer poche starts to taper down, and it seems like just the normal conventional window that you approach. And so you have this strange condition, like from the outside, you know that the inside is different. The geometries are different. The whole kind of organization is different, but you can't quite find where that poche is once you go inside and start looking for it. So I think that's a really subtle move, because it would be one thing to have that kind of massive poche and then do the monadnock trick where you show it off by cutting big channels out from the interior through the thickness. But it seems like your approach has been much more nuanced than that. And that's something I really appreciate about the project.
I was going to take the totally different direction with the exterior, largely because of these interior shots. I find these interior photos so seductive because of how different they are from what you would expect from the exterior. That the exterior and the sections and the emphasis on mass and the poche suggests that you would never get interiors like this. That are all these shots are lit in a way that feels like you're just catching the sun rising over the horizon or just setting over the horizon. You're getting this kind of perfect blast of light coming through that suggests that there's some sort of vast amount of openness at the perimeter that just seems other than what the section suggests. And I'm wondering if maybe a totally different approach to the exterior would be to say, like, no, this entire tube or pair of pants is just that. It's a giant cloth that's being covered over top of this, and the poche is there, it's composed, but it's not physical. And that difference between the outside and the inside is just an open gap of space, and that you use textiles to produce the massing appearance so that you can get these kind of interior lighting conditions that we're seeing in these images. That would just be a totally different approach than either of the other two. I think all three would be amazing though.
Actually, earlier on, when I was exploring with models, I did use fabric as a way of covering. So, and I did want the exterior and interior to be different, like from the exterior, like for it to look heavy, and the interior, like, to be, so like when someone comes in, they'll be like, oh, this is not what we expected. Yeah.
But you've accomplished that. Good representation.
Yeah, I think Zach sort of started bringing this up, and maybe just to add on to this point, so that maybe we can steer it back to the low resolution conversation. When Han Solo was, what happened to him? Like, what he?
He's frozen.
I mean, yeah, it's appropriate because today's May 4th.
May 4th. Thank you so much. I had a joke written down that was, why couldn't Luke Skywalker find love?
Why is that?
Because he was looking in Alderaan places.
Okay.
Good one, Dad.
Okay, kind of keep going. Sorry.
No, I mean, this sort of, this Japanese architect Toshiki Hirano, recently, I don't know if you guys follow him on the internet or anything like that, but recently he's been aggregating. It's very similar to this project, where there's a base aggregation of knickknacks and then a rapid sort of vacuum forming process of cladding over something. I think the question of whether or not this is a brick project or if it's a mud project, right, or so. In either cases, they both address the question of low resolution, right? Like I think, and I just think it's so interesting to maybe unpack this a little bit more and maybe think through the paths forward, right? Is this a precisely low resolution project or a low tech, low resolution project? That's kind of like a super interesting crux here.
I agree, and I find it really fascinating how much we're talking about materiality, because the whole conversation at midterm was about physics. So it was like, what's the kind of like physical rules of your world that you're constructing with this, and how are you true to those? And now we're kind of asking questions about materiality to be able to deliver on those effects. And like, I agree, like and there's interesting contradictions, I think, in any one of those schemas, right? So like if it's fabric, that requires a framework to kind of push it out, right? Like it has to be designed in a certain way versus like the just like pack it in with stuff idea, which is I would think more in tune with the sensibility of your project, but I think the fabric is probably more in tune with the history of the effects you were trying to pull off. So like there's a lot of questions there that I think are really nuanced and interesting. He's hugging it. These are great. Thanks for sharing. Follow. All right, is that it for Rizna?
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
All
speaking of Japan, there is not just sorry, one last comment. You know, there's something so beautiful and horrifying about your work. Like, I don't know if you ever seen the movie Akira. Um, it's I highly recommend Akira, the anime. There's a sequence where the titular. Anyway, exactly, yeah, yeah.
It's
Yeah,
the same
I see
color
it.
scheme too.
With all the good references. All right. Mark, you're still at the back.
Yeah, yeah, they're in order. Okay.
Oh no, why aren't you working? Oh,
What's
no.
up? I was about to request remote control.
No, it's page is unresponsive. Okay. Apologies.
That's okay.
Okay.
All right. All right, we're good to go. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining today. I'm Mark. I'm gonna take you through this project for No Wonder Museum. So this project absorbs information from its context by recognizing the grid as the main driver for developing a massing strategy. Oh no, Stuart, the arrows aren't working. No, that's okay. So at first, rather than looking at the grid as a series of lines, but rather abstract negative spaces within the lines, these abstractions become tools with which to manipulate a generic representation of the site, in this case, a box. So impressing upon the box, it leaves behind a grid in bas relief on the surface. So even though volume has been removed or erased, something new is produced. This is kind of a little bit of a foreshadowing of what's to come. Kind of gives away the whole volume at once. A 2D graphic is then applied to the surface that runs counter to the orthogonal grid that was established by the the extrusions from the abstract negative spaces. The diagonal hatch obscures the form again, but it enhances it simultaneously. And depending on the exterior position, the grid then goes in and out of focus. And you see how it travels around the corner and there as well. But in elevation, it almost like gets absorbed into the facade itself again. Looking at the cut plan, looking more at how 3D elements and how they're positioned work with program and how it operates more in transition. So the lower level, as you come down this ramp and enter, the lobby sprawls out in a gallery that kind of merges with back of house and also loading dock. And this is made possible by the 3D partitions that register to the grid, but are also removed at the same time so that these programs can bleed into one another. In plan, we looked at this as addressing the same, like how to represent kind of those blending of zones or bleeding of program with the hatch that we used on the exterior, and just bringing it into plan. And so you can see with the partitions still in place, but the hatches then are applied to different spaces within that could be occupied for different activity. Same looking at section. Here we get to see more stairs, how they meander through a grid that is registered to, it's a grid registered void where they vary and where they terminate. So it continues that same blending of zones, but this time vertically. Oh, well, we got cut a bit, but we can still take a look at this section. So another system that maintains that original manipulation on the exterior surface of the facade is carried through by the compressing and expanding of these floor plates. And the interiors indicate how floor plates have been removed of space, but still always registered to the grid. And then also picturing the meandering staircase, how it vertically terminates in one zone and then travels to another. Looking at the isometric floor plates, we can see the various deployments of the partitions as they're registered to the grid. The program then can like pulse through these spaces. The gallery being maybe more maze-like. The cafe more open, the office space centralized and as in pink here and closed off. And the deployments do not continue then up to the roof, where it's actually given more over back to the surface and the tectonic facade, where it bends towards the interior and then indicates potential for program and circulation on the roof, in which case the new void then basically opens up or increases possibilities for gathering and activity. And that's my project.
This is the section that was getting cut off.
Oh yeah, apologies. Thanks, Stuart.
So one thing I find kind of curious about your project, and it shows, and it's consistent, probably one of the most consistent things throughout the project beyond the exterior wall systems or the facades or whatever you want to call that. Mm-hmm. And the grounds and the floor are the same thing at the lower level, and that seems, I mean, so yes, okay, so what's the big deal? Well, other than the reality, like the vast majority of the time, the ground and the floor are never the same thing in architecture, right? Like we walk on the floor, the ground's where things grow out of it, and so on. Things live in the ground, things typically don't live on the floor. But when you look at the way in which you've conceived your project as these essentially sides of a volume that you're doing things to, that then means the base is the only thing that you don't do anything to, or you can't do anything to. And it shows up both in the animation, like essentially the ground is a given, you're pulling things out of the ground, pushing things into the ground. You can do whatever you want to the other 5 sides, but the base you can't touch, right? And I find that that's an interesting thing that you don't take advantage of once you get to the section. Like in my mind, that would mean that at the section, somehow that continuity of the desk in this rendering would somehow then change what happens once you get off the ground. So somehow the second floor or the first floor would then have the obligations, but have different obligations than say the third floor or the fourth floor inside the project, which I think could set up an interesting relationship to what you then have on the roof, right? Your roof is a very interesting space because you have the walls, the blue walls that then turn into the roof and the interior of the exterior wall system. And then you have the exterior layer of the exterior walls that then produce this courtyard or cloister up there. And all of that kind of complexity, none of that comes back down to the ground in any way, or comes back down to that second floor in any way, when there's probably opportunities to do that if you just understood that kind of base recognition that's inherent in the initial diagram, which is that you make no distinction between floor and ground.
I'd say, yeah, that's an interesting take. I at one point in the section detail that we were looking at, I did represent it where it actually had kind of built down into the desk, and Stuart had talked about if I was going to represent it that way, it would maybe need to show that I had maybe almost excavated or used the same type of eraser or sensor techniques that I had been referring to in the presentation. I think ultimately it may have just distracted from the different deployments that I was currently focused on. But I think you're totally right as far as like looking at from like a fundamental standpoint of, okay, you're going to do all of these, you're going to follow all these rules, but then you kind of like, this is a very large area to maybe not disregard, but should have probably required a little, should have maybe granted more attention.
You were supposed to like say, Grant, you misread it. Look at my other section that's sitting right beside that rendering on the screen where you do go down into the ground and there's things going on. Like there's something going, like you're doing something different here than those other images that I'm referring to.
Yeah, so there's, to clarify, there's a ramp. This is a ramp downward. And the first floor, or the entry is what, like 10 feet down in?
Yeah.
But the point still holds, I think.
Yeah, I think it comes from just the representational trick of showing it as a model on a desk. The basement then has to be what it sits on top of the desk. And so, yeah, it has a totally different reading in that version of the project. And I think we've seen that in a few of the previous examples as well, where that representational style just totally shifts the spatial organization. So it almost looks like we're going from the ground up the ramp here, as opposed to that would actually be at the ground level when it's placed into a site model. I think it's interesting though, the way the ground is handled or the floor is handled throughout the rest of the project. And it looks like what you've done is really given priority to that facade and the grid. And it turns out that you wanted your floor to ceiling to be smaller than the size of the window. And so that you have to make those shifts at the edges so that the floor plate doesn't come into the middle of the window. Can you talk a little bit about that detail and how it developed?
We, early on in the semester, we had a few conversations about this, and one was actually maybe to even just like disregard it completely, just have stick the floor plates wherever. It doesn't matter if it registers to those indentations that were made at first. But I think ultimately it seemed a little overwhelming and just maybe messy isn't the right word, but it felt like we needed to follow the initial move and kind of just maybe be more obedient as far as transitioning towards the interior. But the way that they had been set up, they were too static. We wanted to make different heights that could potentially give more priority to different program Like the office spaces, for example, are given larger spaces, which maybe is almost counter to gallery spaces, because we looked at different examples of like SF MoMA, for example, has like huge like triple overhead spaces for their galleries. But there's a few like dichotomies, right? Like the diagonal versus the grid. Thinking about like making a huge ramp for like the front entrance, and then the back of house entrance is just, you know, tucked right in front. So kind of playing with it somewhat is linked to like what is there, what is not there, and playing a little bit of opposites.
To a certain degree, it reminds me of the conversation around Ashley's project, where there was this contradiction between two systems, one about nesting, one about stacking. And then just by the nature of following that through, it produced a tension on the interior that became an opportunity. I think perhaps it's the same thing for you. It didn't start from that idea that you're going to have the floor plate shift down at the edges. It resulted from earlier decisions, but I think it's maybe an opportunity to develop even further and think about what it could become programmatically and how much that width should be of the floor plate changing at the edges. Yeah, so I think there's an opportunity there.
There are moments where part of that floor plate gets cut away, or the sections that are elevated are cut into, so they become kind of more like exterior corridors. But in your comment about Ashley's, I agree that in the conversation, I think was more about like expectations, but thinking about that as a way of laying out plan and when to remove things, when to keep them there was to kind of like maybe go against what may be expected.
I'm pretty interested in the plan and section drawing in the representation. Yeah, those right there in the representation of the way that you're defining these different zones within the building. I think that's one of the most exciting things about the project. But I really see it much less in the image just to the left, right? In the rendering of the plan, or in the section drawing, for example. And I would love to see those hatch patterns either as kind of literal hatch patterns, or as or as in three-dimensional zones, which are designating differences in the qualities of the space, right? Whether it be material, lighting, color, like however you're defining that. The partition walls help define that, but in the plan, there's so much kind of rich overlap and definition that you get in those zones that does seem to get a little bit lost for me in the other drawings. And so I wonder, if it were to go further, how would you actually reinscribe that in the space itself three-dimensionally, and not only as a two-dimensional pattern?
Yeah. So like, do you think it's maybe competing with the renderings as far as like, if we have these, because this is something we talked about prior to presentation, as far as just, we like this maybe as concept, but is it almost too different, even though it is applying a hatch like we did in the beginning? Is it too different from the renderings as far as?
Yeah, I guess
like,
I'm saying I think it's better.
Okay.
I think that's a better, not as a representational strategy, as an idea about the building. Like, I want that building. I want to go in that building rather than the one on the left, right? Than like the one on the right. I want to go in the building where I could be in this really large room and look around and identify 12 other rooms that I can see, but I'm not literally standing in, right? Like, the spatial complexity of that plan is so rich. And then when I see the rendering, it's just much more straightforward, right? And I think there are architectural techniques, is what I'm saying, that you could actually make whatever has the crosses different than whatever has the diagonal lines than whatever has the triangles, right? Like that would be the challenge to you, which is like, okay, here's this amazing plan and idea of spatial overlap and sectioning and making difference within one giant room. But how would I use architectural techniques to actually make it such that when I'm in that kind of yellow floor space, of the ground floor, and I'm mostly just looking at the ground floor here because that's the drawing that's there. That ground floor rendering on the left, how do I understand the multiplicity of spatial conditions and the number of different zones and rooms that I'm actually inhabiting at once?
That's a great point.
Yeah, that drawing was one that came later, and did seem like a real discovery. And so I kind of wholeheartedly agree with that. That the promise of that as a way of thinking about space, that may or may not look exactly like that, but that somehow delivers on the promise of that conditions that it's offering.
I remember when I was at UIC with you guys, the Bruges Concert Hall was such an important project to talk about, right? From Neutling's Redijk Architects. And it's in fact maybe even related to some of the other projects that we looked at earlier today. Not this one, right? This is the actual winning scheme. The one, yes, that's the one. This is the losing scheme that people tend to talk about a bit more. So the part-to-part relationship between the, let's say, disparate masses are unified by the consistent gift-wrapped paper, like gift-wrapped facade. And in relation to Mark's project, I'm viewing it as maybe continuation of the gift-wrapping conversation. But it's very different, right? I think whereas, the Bruges Concert Hall from Neutling's Redijk Architect attempts to unify the disparate parts, the gift wrapping here is working to signify the lack of architectural elements, right? I think, so the transition of colors where the changes of patterns suggest the presence of windows in locations where there are not windows, for instance. Or perhaps even areas that are windowed in this representation anyway seem to have, let's say, been also vacuum formed in such a way that the windows disappear in place of the windows, and now gift wrap. And there's even a third condition where the graphic windows superimpose onto the actual physical windows. So I'm left thinking, where are we at in UIC anyway? If we were to trace it all the way back to the Bruges Concert Hall, how can we talk about Mark's gift wrapping as an extension of the previous gift wrappings? And not that, I mean, I don't know. I'm starting to try to talk about it, like the signification of the lack of architectural elements, right? That's one way. Yeah.
There's this woman, Sean Guy, who talks about different aesthetic categories. One is cute, the other is zany.
Zany, yeah, that's right.
Zany
Yeah,
and interesting.
yeah.
And they exist on a continuum. And that's, in addition to other aesthetic categories like beautiful and, whatever there is.
But then there's a kind of like biological kind of like attack associated with all this.
Yeah,
Anyway, so,
and I guess the way that you're describing Mark's project makes me think it's kind of zany, right? Like, so zany is it's seen in comedy, like Lucille Ball or somebody's like kind of like going crazy, like it's always coming at you as a way of it's like the opposite of cool, or it's on the opposite end of like, deadpan or cool or lack of information. It's kind of like bombarding you with information as a way of disguising and like camouflaging and that sort of thing. And so I don't know if I quickly took I don't know, in one way I think his project's kind of zany, in that sense. Like, is it a facade? It's not a facade. Is it someone else's facade? It's someone else's facade. Like, you know, there's just kind of like all of these competing readings simultaneously, not through lack of information, but by abundance of it. Well, that was time. I mean, I'm thank you. I'm happy that we're able to kind of find a direction for all of UIC in a conversation about this. I love that we can zoom in and out to past and current conversations. So thanks a lot, Mark.
Thanks everyone.
All right. Next up is one Calvin.
Yeah.
Let me get us going.
No, further out.
Oh, JK. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Let's see if this bad boy works. Cool. All right. Hello, everyone. And once again, thank you all for joining us today. This project smuggles the museum into the neighborhood by appropriating secondary architectural elements, such as sidewalls and foundational pieces, and staging them on the site like a set for a theater production. In doing so, the project is able to adhere to the local regulations, which call for new structures to meet contextual standards, while not being literal in how these fulfill the requirements. Okay. As such,
It's loading.
Okay.
It's loading.
As such, walls lean as though they are set panels, with the main tower appearing as a curtain wrapped around the gallery spaces, which wind their way up like a large continuous stage. Additionally, elements like the panels and tower walls take on a graphic characteristic, appearing as though they were painted on. This graphic nature extends inside as well, with the main pieces in the galleries, these shapes, taking the form of the wavy graphic lines seen on the exterior.
Sorry.
Oh, Grant. Can't take you anywhere.
I guess there's always mistakes in productions. Okay. In total, this grouping of separate elements on the site and around an existing building, which is this teal part in the plan, become coherent and organized through the use of standardized shapes, colors, and materials that are unrelated to their origins. The museum itself is composed of an existing building which houses program elements like the lobby, the gift shop, and an eating area, which is here. And the new tower coming out of it both vertically and horizontally, which houses the gallery spaces. The shape and materiality of these two structures contrast each other, with the existing building being composed of angular walls made of hard materials, while the tower has wavy walls that appear to be made of a more pliable substance. Connecting these two elements is the vertical circulation core, which rises up the tower like an extension of the existing building. Furthermore, the two elements are united by a continuous floor, which flows from the entry plaza through the lobby and up the tower to the rooftop. Within the galleries, large wavy elements dominate the space. These are of various shapes and sizes, with some of them being used as benches, others as pedestals or walls for art to be displayed, or as art pieces in and of themselves. Overall, the concept of the project being a theater production within the neighborhood extends to the means in which it is represented. This manifests as drawings on the various images, as though they were done by a marker after the fact, and the section model becoming a physical piece created and being studied by an unseen person. Thank
Just a question for clarification. So there's an existing building on the site that I guess all the other projects have been demolishing. Is that the case? And then you're proposing to keep part of it?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's up to the students to decide what to do with it.
Gotcha. Okay. I think in the way in which it responds to the brief and the themes that the studio has laid out, there's a lot of really clever moves here. It reminds me that the walls that are leaning against that have some kind of scalar relationship to the context reminds me of the first office project, Blocks of Blah Blah, which they exhibited at the Oslo Triennial. They were asked, I believe, to look at storage buildings, just given that typology and develop something. And so they take the facades of those, do the color blocking that you see on many of those large storage buildings. And then I think through both a web app they developed, you could actually place them that would simulate gravity, but also they built and shipped the plywood pieces over there. And I think people were allowed to interact with them and lean them in various ways. So I think there's a kind of reference there that seems like a nice way of, again, tying this back to the context, because the building that lies behind those is so very different. And it's not only of its graphic character, but to a certain extent, its scale as well. It's like that was a clever move to have to respond to the context in some way while still playing the games that you wanted to play formally and aesthetically. I'm curious about the scale of those interior squiggles that always remain at a furniture scale. And I imagine there were probably conversations, whether at mid reviews or in desk crits, about, should they always be so consistent? Should they scale up and become these kind of Boolean Gordon Maddox Clark cuts in the ramped floor that goes around? But you've, I think, stuck to this scale that translates quite literally to the exterior graphic scale on the facade. Can you talk a little bit about that decision?
Yeah, but you pretty much touched right upon it. We were kind of discussing it in the sense that the graphic on the facade, like those pieces, had been kind of cut out of the wall and then had either fallen inside or outside and literally became the pieces within. So like, as you can see in the plaza out front, those shapes become benches, and as if like they had cut them out of the wall and said, okay, now we can use these throughout the museum.
Zach, it's super interesting because I was thinking about a different first office project, but this project that Kevin is showing us sort of combines the both, and maybe this link will dropping will kind of reference a little bit some of your questions about the squiggles on the interior, right? This is kind of one of the super old first office projects, like an antithesis of what they do now, kind of, like especially in the conversation of high or low resolution. I can't tell if in this first office project we're talking about a type of fidelity to the like furriness of the edge conditions that you do in a raster process in Photoshop, and it seems that they kept the fuzziness of the Photoshop output in such a way that the high fidelity implies a type of high resolution attitude towards things, whereas by the time they started working on the Oslo competition, the resolution dropped. Exhibition, the resolution dropped so low that it's these kinds of pieces of plywood that just crumbles onto one another. Kevin's project makes me think about the dialogue between that early phase and the later phase of first office. I'm not sure, Kevin, if you guys were talking about first office or not, but it's so evident that from start to finish there's something.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly when, but it definitely came up. in some form or another.
But in a way, I also kind of want to think about the follow-up question, right? Which is, what do we do with that? It's kind of interesting that we are looking at these two moments of first office career. Like, what do we do with that in terms of the interiority? To maybe pick up on Zach's question, is, you know, in an archipelago situation, there are these kinds of slightly less predictable, expansive and contractive moments where spatially it's a really interesting and complicated set of, you know, opening and closings, right? And here, as though it's sort of an exhibition space, you're leaving it yet undefined. But I do wonder programmatically, how else might we be able to think about this? I mean, it breaks the door of what an enfilade is or isn't at this point, because, you know, some of the archipelago sort of sprinklings of these squiggle shapes, they create such a kind of abundance of obstacle that you can't really occupy, you know, these kinds of gaps as rooms so comfortably. There aren't also, you know, easily definable corridors, right? And
Right.
so therefore, the closest thing that we can maybe associate this with is enfilades. But then it's also not a straight enfilade because, you know, again, the sprinkling of the archipelagos, exactly, enfilade. Which, if you follow Stuart Hicks's YouTube channel, he covers this at one point. But the best YouTube channel on the internet. Anyway, no, I think it's really interesting, you know, the way that you dealt with the, I mean, yeah, because this is a very straightforward enfilade, but the archipelago that you created produces a very complicated enfilade, hopefully in a good way, right?
Yeah, I will say that it developed more from, I guess, kind of a 2D plan sense of taking that graphic that was on the exteriors and pushing them inside. And I guess not as an afterthought, but as kind of a secondary to that thought of, well, then how do I extend that to be an inhabitable 3D space? So I guess I was always tied to that 2D graphic style, but I guess, you know, now looking in retrospect, that is a very interesting way to look at it.
I mean, the 2D graphic effect is something that's interesting, I think, because of the premise that you've set up about this idea of the stage set and the kind of painted sort of lean-to false front. So it just leaves me wanting more falseness on the interior, more fake things on the interior, because I think that that's just such an it's such a nice move, right? And it only occurs actually on the street. But I wonder what other things, you know, the first one I can think of is actually on the roof, right? So there's a Google roof image of every building, probably the first image that a lot of people see of whatever building exists, right? So that's another moment where you could introduce this kind of stage set play of parts and kind of false fronts. And then I'm wondering what that could be as an interior. Because I think, I mean, it was an interesting thing to say, okay, I have this 2D pattern. And so then on the interior, I'm going to make it 3D shapes, 3D forms. But I'm actually wondering what the 2D pattern, or maybe the 2D pattern in combination with, like, my favorite elevation is the purple one, the purple elevation with the windows painted on it, because it's both the false front and it employs the 2D graphic. And I'm kind of more interested in that graphic than the actual squiggle graphic, like the graphic of the windows, but they don't line up, so that you know that it's a painted, that it's just a graphic, as they would like in a set, right? Like think about a theater set, they don't have to account for structure. They don't have to account for all sorts of things. So like things can be thicker or thinner because they're just painted on, right?
Right.
And so I love this elevation actually. And I'm wondering what an interior looks like that is more born out of this elevation, where the building you've kind of, you know, designed, or no, you have designed, building you've designed, I want to say you designed the entire thing, but the building at the museum itself, the white box, is actually only maybe a quarter of this image, right? And so if on the interior, you're really kind of experiencing, say, a quarter of what you have on the interior right now, and 3/4 of it is a kind of false interior, I think that's super exciting.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I guess, not to keep saying the same thing, but yeah, I guess I got really bogged down by the, well, not in a bad way, but I really stuck with the kind of squiggle graphics. But this did start as those walls and taking elements from the neighborhood and making them these false pieces that then were used. And I guess outside of that, that never really extended, but it would be interesting to play with that more throughout the whole project.
And sorry, Stuart, this is a question for you. What level are these students? Are you guys graduating, or do you have more time?
They're first year grads.
Oh my gosh, so you have so much more time to explore these issues, because I mean, I would never tell a student that to continue to work on something over the summer, because I really think you guys need a break. But what I would say is that you can return to this thought, right, in future projects, right? The idea of like a kind of false stage set or something, right? So even if like one project in your career kind of like, okay, you made the turn and you made it more about the graphic, but you can always kind of recast and look back on work and say, oh, but what I'm actually interested in now about this project is, you know, X, Y, or Z. And that might be something that as a topic you explore in a future project. So I would just say that's another thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm in agreement with Ashley. The like what's real, what's graphic, or what's fake, what's painted on, I think could be really compelling if you took that more seriously through the project. I mean, I really love the first two elevations and the top axon, because where you can't really, I mean, like this weird black outline at the cornice around parts of the building, but not always around the walls that are leaning up against things. And then like the tracing of the garage door as though it's like an earnest tracing and we see the seams, versus like blacking out a window. Like those sort of differences, saying where like one moment I'm blacking something out and the other moment I'm tracing a seam. I think like you could take that very, very seriously, and you could take ways in which you can misread that very, very seriously to produce a lot of different ways to challenge what you're doing with the punch outs in the wavy wall. Like for me, the idea that the squiggle turns into a hole that then turns into a piece that falls on the interior, and then that gets extruded thicker than what it was when it was just a piece that fell through the wall and becomes a rather conventional partition on the inside. Like that seems too easy, and it seems like there's probably a lot more compelling ways to think through the problem of the applied graphic when it's an opening, when it's not an opening, how you could allow it to be both at the same time. That could be really compelling. And in my mind, it goes back to these elevation, the way in which you would work through elevation, which probably means the section would be a bit more dominant once you move down through the project, rather than really respecting the building logic and then applying things to the existing building logic, if that makes sense.
No, definitely. Yeah, that's yeah, I see what you mean. And you know, now that it's pointed out, I mean, not to look down at my own work, but yeah, it does seem kind of a, I don't know, straightforward way to take it, and not necessarily the most interesting.
I mean, it's not about like whether it's good or bad or interesting or not. I just think
Right.
there's parts of this that are really compelling. And I mean, this is always the trick. Like we all do this. We stumble onto something and then we like fumble around with it. And it's like, oh, if I would have done that a little bit better, like that's really actually compelling. And like that's part of the process. So, I mean, that's part of like, I agree with Ashley, like you next time as you move forward.
Right. Yeah, no, that's what I mean. It's definitely something that, like Ashley said, it becomes a tool that I can pull out in the future and play with in some other project and maybe in some other way.
Kevin's also agreeable. He'll just agree with whatever you say. So.
Ooh, I'm squarely under the bus on that one. Thanks.
I mean, I think like in my I wholeheartedly agree with everyone about where the success.
Wait, he's the agreeable one.
He's the
I'm
agreeable.
about to contradict you, brother. I was just buttering you up. I agree with where I think the successes lie in like what you were talking about, Grant. I think, so these projects were clearly designed from the outside in. I think there was a kind of impulse to be like, well, you know what? I don't really care that much about like creating a compelling section. Like here's a kind of base condition. Here's kind of a normal. And can we leave it at that? And kind of the answer is usually no. Like you got to have some great interior idea to complement your exterior idea. And I kind of see Kevin's as kind of like, well, I'd never disrupt my ramp. Like it's just a ramp. It goes up and it's got some, furniture pieces on it that promise difference and unique situations that deliver on my graphic promise, but it's not, like it is what it is kind of. So I there's where I'm going to try and disagree. Where
But I would argue that he's already, I don't think it's an issue of inside and out. I think it's an issue of plan and section. And I think that his best moves are happening in section, or not section, in elevation, which is a section. And thus there's an obligation to think more thoroughly through the entirety of all the sections of the project, whether it's inside or out, I don't care. It's just that the best moves are happening elevationally, which means that there's probably some obligation that the section has to adjust accordingly.
All right. Well, thanks. I'm going to pause it before it runs out and beeps in everybody's ear. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you, everyone, for
Being
your
so
comments.
agreeable. All right. 2 more.
Hello, everybody. My name's Colin. Hopefully my internet's going to hold up for us right now. Let me just get remote control. Is it loading, Stuart?
No, I'll do it.
Okay.
Now it is.
Okay. In response to the studio's prompt, this project aims to maintain a loose fit between forms of elements, their surface articulation, and the relationship between them. By utilizing an ancillary infrastructure elements from surrounding buildings and blowing them up to the scale of a building, a contextual story is told relating directly back to the neighboring buildings. So you can see in this GIF how that stairwell element that we see often on the top of urban buildings, it's kind of plucked off and scaled up, and this project really tries to stay true to that form itself. Okay. A lot of this has been driven by a discovery from an earlier project this semester, in which a model making process produced a specific type of surface articulation, which had an effect of blurring the lines between 2D and 3D space. So in this diagram, you kind of see how that volume is pulled apart into its surfaces and then chopped up at the corners to create a type of joint. And then reassembled and through coloration of different volumes and kind of projecting those volumes onto other things, you get a collapse of space where you start to read objects that are behind as things that are in front. Just you get a more flat image. So this stitching, which we just discussed, helps flatten the three-dimensionality of the grouping of volumes while never favoring one vantage point, but always shifting as you walk about the site. This challenges the autonomy of the single volumes by blurring the lines of where one starts and the other begins. And then also through a braille-like treatment of the windows, scaled similarly to the box joints, this idea of autonomy is further explored by distorting the levels of the interior. The museum is further contextualized compared to the city in the way you enter the building, much like many of the buildings in the city having multiple ways of getting into them, such as front entrances, back of house entrances, like those utilized in the historic meatpacking district of Fulton Market, and still today. There's a specific separation between the public face of the museum for those seeking the cafe and the store, and the more commercial side for those seeking access to the museum. All this creates a complex with multiple levels of permeability. Okay, so with a focus on influencing commuters from the CTA line to the south, the south massing is folded in a way that creates more open space and encourages the people to go down the immediately visible stramp or continue to be drawn into the groupings between them, as you can see here, to be drawn into the more public area in that plaza space or in the cafe. So in that outdoor, in the ground floor plan, you can see how there's a kind of a secondary alleyway that winds up to the center of the massing. And through the ramp, you enter the more public volume, which brings you into the cafe. And if you go up to the second floor, you'll see a shop. As well as if you go down, it brings you down to the lower level plan, which gives you access to the to getting into the museum itself. And you can also access that through the stramp, which is seen on to the south, sorry. Also through this shifting and manipulating of the single volumes, you get a series of pinches and expansive moments within the building and also outside of the building. So through this interior perspective, you can begin to feel how that through the shifting and slipping of the prominent volumes, you get a series of expansive spaces followed by regions of compression. This serves to structure the space and create large generalized zones. The stair-like displays aim to structure the space into more specific zones and break up the larger areas. Looking at the axonometric view, we have another chance to see how these surface articulations and colorations distort the single volumes. At first, you're looking at the volumes themselves, but through shifting angles and coloration, larger zones can be defined and 3D spaces become flattened. As you can kind of see in these, this grouping of 3 volumes in the north. If you're kind of looking at color schemes, you're seeing one big blue volume. Also, these 2 volumes here, the way the stitch seam kind of runs down the center of the massing, you read the single volume in the middle, and then a little bit like a triangle shape to the left in pink. Stop that. And then as a cherry on top, this 3D section helps to understand the separation, yet ultimate connection of the volumes. With public space to the left and the museum space to the right, you have a clear visual and physical separation, but through a large circulation path through the lower level lobby, the separate towers are ultimately connected and regulated. That's it.
Stuart, let's go back to the conversation or the point you were making at the end of the last project about these projects being from the outside in. And like, what point does the interior matter? Like, Colin, you got an issue or a position on that?
For me in this project, it was more about how the massings influence the people coming from the CTA line and outside, and how paths through and inside of the volumes can be influenced. So really the planning that happened on the outside kind of caused a more generic interior.
I also take issue with your characterization, Grant. I didn't say the interior doesn't matter. I think just to kind of, at what point can they just be a kind of straightforward and logical reaction to other conditions that have been deemed important?
I like putting words in your mouth. Yeah, I mean, in my mind, this is one of those projects that struggles with that. I mean, it's a very earnestly done project. Like, I think it resolves itself well, and it's clear that you're thinking very holistically about it as a building that works. And I like the way in which it breaks down into smaller, essentially two buildings that are then made up of smaller buildings. All of that seems driven by both an earnestness to stay true to the exterior considerations and working your way towards resolving it through the initial diagram and these kind of folded joints, the coloration of different panels that don't match with the massing and so on. But then I wonder about like why. Like you're allowed to demarcate the roof, but the floors don't matter. Like the floors are all the same tone, and the logic of the panel and the fold and the disruption of where the panel is legible in the certain orientations and certain drawings. Like none of that then comes to the interior, even though you're drawing like this drawing that we're looking at here, the kind of cutaway axonometric drawing. Like that drawing is just as significant as some of the other views that you are using to help justify the lack of legibility or the blurred legibility of the panel to the massing relationship. And I wonder, like, why is it that it's important when you don't slice through the object, but it's not important when you do slice through the object, given that the value is still born out of the same drawing nature? Does that make any sense?
I think so. Struggling a little bit to follow.
So if you go, I mean, I think your first two elevations are absolutely gorgeous, and it's very clear what the motivations of the project are through those first two elevations. And then you can very easily jump down to the axonometric of, I don't know, of the site, the second rendering up from the bottom. And it's clear that those elevations and that axon are like the drawings in which you want the project to be evaluated through. It's where the considerations of composition and the motivations of the project are clearly aligned with one another. Yet that cutaway axonometric that we're looking at is just another version of this drawing, in my mind, taken from a different angle, cutting through the thing rather than looking outside of it. Like, why does it not get that same, why do those same considerations then not infect the interior
in the same way.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction to what Grant is describing. And I don't even know if it's a design decision. I think you could go two different directions on the design, but it's kind of caught in between where it aesthetically kind of matches the rest of the drawings in terms of the use of the blue and the pink, but the logic of how the blue and the pink are deployed in the interior doesn't really follow how it's deployed elsewhere.
Okay.
The one place in that axon where it looks like it might, the cutaway one, is the outside. I don't know if it's a exterior kind of plinth or plaza, that little triangular sliver that almost looks like it's folding off of the pink there. Yeah, exactly. Then we see that same move elsewhere, and it's actually not folding. It's just a pink additive piece that's brought in. But I think if you thought about the way in which this could potentially come down the walls and then turn, just the same way that it turns at the roof, like Grant described, that would be one strategy that would bring that logic to the interior. The alternative idea might be to say that you just treat the interior as not having the pink and blue at all, and that it really is the exterior shell, but that everything on the inside gets more unified, both representationally by a gray or a white, but also materially in the building. You think about that distinction only belonging to the exterior walls and roof of the volume. So I think it's kind of caught in between those two directions. And that would be one potential place to look. But overall, I find it a really compelling project, especially in those elevations. I think the clarity of projecting these colors onto forms that don't match, there's a lot of richness there. It makes me think of Andrew Zago's work on misregistration. If you're not familiar with that, he gave a great lecture that will really kind of clarify how he's thinking about that particular technique.
He's very familiar with that, yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's really interesting. Kind of how they're influencing the ground plane on the interior. And that'd be a good direction to take. And we did argue pretty late in the semester about whether or not the coloration would take form inside, or if it would just be a single unified thing. So yeah, it's definitely something to consider.
I think what you're seeing with that is a bit of sometimes hesitancy, I think, or like that there were a few things in flux for a while, right? So like the box joint wasn't actually always there. And it became clear how important it was. Then the next step being, so the box joint was there, but then the sort of misregistered colors weren't always there. Those kind of came after that. And it's clear how important they become, but how late they become in the design process means that, yeah, sort of like looking at it now, it makes sense that the interior would be folded in, like literally and symbolically to that system, versus where before he was kind of thinking it as a kind of shell over a kind of core condition.
The other thing that's been really fascinating to follow throughout all the projects is the way in which representation is operating in a really, I think, aggressive way in terms of how we understand these, and probably how you as designers think about the work. If you go to the image that we've seen for everyone where it's a model on the table, in your case, I wonder if there was ever a temptation to think about that as a generative drawing, that the fact that beyond the model, there are these pieces that look like maybe they're in progress, in production, we see on the actual ground of the desk itself, not part of the project yet. Like, would there be those kind of pieces brought into the site as some kind of, whether it's benches or site furniture, that would speak to the box joint, right? Be able to see it where it's actually not in use, but just a fragment of that. So there's a way in which the representation might come back and inform the design, even at that late stage.
That's great.
Yeah, I don't know how related my comment is going to be, but it's also one of those throughout day observations. I mean, I've sort of brought this up a little bit earlier, but now in this case, the I guess signature of Lu Con seems to be just really in the room, right? Like I think the Dominican Mother House, for example. I'm not sure if it's a conversation that Colin you've had with Stuart, or maybe even the Fisher House. This idea of the corner to corner joinery between spaces. That to me is one of the most pronounced. Fisher House, yeah, or the Dominican Mother House. I think that plan also does something. It's really obvious in plan if you read the plan of this project. Right now, we're seeing mostly, right, yeah, an instance like that where the corner of the square is jutted into another corner of. But story. While we're at it, should we look at also the Dominican Mother House? Where it's whereas the Fisher House is really just one instance of a square on a square. Here, there's a number of geometries interacting with their corner conditions, so what then, right? Like when we look at corner conditions like this, I'm thinking. Obviously, spatially, like the idea, I guess one of the 5 points of Bob Solmo was organized surprises, right? Did you guys have to study the 5 points of Bob Solmo? I don't know if that's still a thing. But organized surprises to me has always been super interesting with regards to the programmatic sequencing between a sharp corner versus a soft corner, or maybe a hard corner versus a soft corner in this case. I think, the moment that you adjoin two corners together, I feel like there's a programmatic opportunity to suggest that, the next spaces where, as you approach the next geometry, there's a kind of visual obstruction due to the nature of these kinds of oblique surfaces from the angles of the squares, or the angles of the rotation, that the expansiveness of the next room, or the lack of immediate visual connection of the next room, affords a super nice opportunity for organized surprises. I mean, that's always been the way that I read that point from Bob. Amongst other ways of using it, but that's one of the ways. I guess that's one of the ways I've always read that point. When you sharpen the corner or something like that. And so I see an opportunity here, and I also feel like the contrasting colors that you're relying to register some type of atmospheric. I don't know if this is diagrammatic or atmospheric. I'm going to take it at its face value and imagine that it's atmospheric, right? I think these contrasting atmospheric colors that you're embedding, there might be a kind of way to think about the hyper compressed corners, and whether or not you introduce the same atmosphere from before and after, where you kind of I think both could be interesting. Maybe lastly, just speaking on the terms of oblique surfaces, right? I think the directionality of the circulation path that's kind of sculpted by your or reoriented geometries. I can imagine that the perpendicular angle from which you view something, like the perspective of a subject who's inside of your space. I think every single time you do these kinds of rotations, you're introducing a bunch of oblique surfaces. And I'm just thinking as a different way of thinking about, this is not exactly the function of the oblique the way that Paul Virilio or Claude Parent would have talked about it, but I'm thinking more as a kind of sequencing of interior elevations on an oblique. It could be a really, still similar to the kind of atmospheric comment I was making. Like if you're talking about large patches of color on a bias, automatically I would imagine there's going to be some type of gradient created because of the oblique condition. Anyway, I like these moves, and I feel like I'm just talking spatially right now, which is maybe not appropriate in Stuart's studio, but but I think spatially this is really complex and interesting.
Thank you.
Stuart, that wasn't a jab. I was just feel like if you set up the focus to be about low resolution, I should focus on low resolution, not space. But I couldn't help talking about space. I'm sorry.
No, I guess no, I do think we should talk about space as a component, and I do think we should talk about interiority in the way that the interiors relate. I guess like a question for like Colin's project would be, well, the unit size is already pretty small and tight, and by its nature produces those conditions that you're talking about. That by its nature it produces the oblique axes, the rotations and things like that, and the interior flooring and things could be relatively straightforward, just sectionally, and still do that, right? So I guess the question in my eyes is like how exuberant does the interior need to be, either registering its connection with the interior situation or on its own, in order to perform at a level of expected intricacy and exuberance, I guess, is I guess a question. Like, so like in Colin's case, like I mean, yeah, so I'm rambling, but I don't have an answer. All right, that was time. Thank you so much, Colin.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
All right, we have one more. We good? Good to keep plowing? Okay. All right, let's do this.
Stuart, could you
Yeah.
start my GIF, please, first?
I don't know if it'll help. Because I think we determined it may not.
Oh, really?
But we'll see.
Okay, find out. Thank you.
Is this you? No, this is you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Emily. I'll get started by saying that this project is made of grids. Grids of windows line the streets of the Fulton Market neighborhood. Sorry, I forgot to reverse control. I was here clicking. Okay. Which in this project are extrapolated through the building's skin. A multiplicity of grids is then introduced by layering a flattened checkerboard volume beneath a highly textured draped fabric grid. This interplay between varying levels of resolution of surface present as both fighting for the foreground. Layering of grids is continued as a strategy and plan. This project is placed on the site at an angle, merged with the existing building in order to stimulate a planned condition which softly designates lobby, cafe, gallery, and plaza on this side. Overlapping fields gives you a mechanism to slip between these zones smoothly. And I'll just go through the different levels of the plan, starting with the ground. And just take note that the grid is visible in the interior through the ceiling, where a truss system is able to freely hang art away from the skin. The scale at which the fabric exists compared to the scale of a person turns it into an exploratory surface. Fabric surfaces are substituted into grid squares of the floors at varying levels, registering both above and below people who are wandering through the section. They can be touched, laid in, they hover above, and they adjust to conditions of different exhibition possibilities. The space at the roof, which is accessible by elevator, protruding into the fabric here, and then different areas of subtractive zones of the checkerboard form allows for the truest reading of the drape with the ability to wander between these two layers of skin, literally blanketed. The fabric grid is flexible. It can be altered through operable panels of the checkerboard grid beneath it, ultimately adjusting to conditions, needs for the site and the museum itself. Thank you.
How many grids would you say are in the project? Are there more than just one?
So I guess I've thought about the grid as, yeah, there's more than one. There's, from a formal perspective, there's the grid which is designated through the checkerboard panels. There's the added skin of the fabric on top of that. And then in a plan strategy, I was thinking of an existing grid being situated into the existing building, which when this form is merged into it, is a sort of interplay between two grids where different scales are happening inside due to the truss system, or also the fabric being placed into the grid. And yeah, the towers of the stairs and the bathroom is kind of the average size of the grid, which is coming from the panels and then kind of changes as it goes throughout.
Yeah, that answers my question. I certainly see the kind of multiple layers of your grid and the way in which it changes scales, but it's more or less aligned to itself, although one is made of fabric, and so it kind of has some distortions. But I was curious whether you were thinking about the original building site as a grid, that it is kind of overlapping with, and there's that tension in a way that, you know, you think about several Eisman projects would also be exploiting that tension. And maybe that would be the place I would be thinking about how it manifests, right? There's certainly the edge of the existing building that we can see is on a different orientation. You know, where are the other moments we could start to read a grid, and, you know, would it break the rules to start to reinforce grid lines in that existing building that are maybe implied by the orientation of the walls, but aren't necessarily inscribed through the architecture in the way that your grid is inscribed on the ceiling? I think the use of the ceiling through this truss system is really clever, and I think it does the work you want it to do spatially, architecturally, experientially, but still provides a lot of freedom for how we might think about using this as a museum. And so, yeah, I was curious how much the other building that's existing would read as a grid per se, or read as a single wall that's coming into conflict with your grid system. But unlike some of the others, this is certainly one that started, it seems like, from the interior. At least the interior condition was central to the exploration, it seems.
Yeah, I would say that the exterior face of the existing building, with the sort of columns that are attached to the side of it, were initially something that I was toying with, being kind of central to the plan and organization, but then ultimately we kind of talked about using this wall as a sort of break over it. And so letting the truss system run over it, and you kind of get like a merging of the two zones, and just like a moment where it doesn't exactly meet the system that is coming onto it.
Emily, where is the perspective image in the lower right of the board? Where is that image taken?
The lower right, that is, yeah, that's in that
It's
zone
almost
at the, yeah.
Okay. Because that, I mean, that's kind of what I've been looking for in other places. I mean, it's a very beautiful project, and I'm just really captivated, I think, by that exterior skin, like the form of it, the texture of it, the spatial possibilities of it in contrast to the rigidity of the frame, the steel frame, that it is kind of everything that the frame is not, yet both are a grid, right? So I think that's like what's smart about the idea that your project is about grids, like the like a mop head. I don't know what you've been calling it, but I'll call it a mop head. Like the mop head has a grid on it, right? And then the frame is literally in a grid. So they're like, again, they're both kind of dealing with this idea of grid, but they're completely different in their physics and kind of texture. And so I'm looking for those spaces where you'd be able to experience both at once, in the way that I think what's successful about the plan is that you're experiencing both grids, like these conflicting grids that are turning towards each other. You're experiencing both of those grids at once. And I would love to see the mop head have a little more kind of dual experience. And I think you're starting to do that in this section where I see the kind of droopy pit where you can drop a person into, yeah, there. Or I was sketching down at the rendering at the very bottom. On top, yeah, right there, for example. So there's a kind of mound, and then there's a droop. But then what I really want to know, is like how I get into that space, and what's that space, and how does it an extension of those interior spaces, or how they are an extension of it. And so that there's that kind of third grid, which is conflicting with the interior two grids, but that third grid is like completely soft and floppy, and not a grid which is rigid and frame. Yeah, I guess that's it. That's that space maybe or this is one of those moments, right? This is one of the spaces, and in addition to the other perspective I pointed out, where that happens.
Yeah, you can kind of see the panel lifted up and the fabric kind of tucked on the side in that other one. Yeah, it's kind of that perspective is taken just before where I'm cutting in the section. So, but yeah, I think that's true. Like, I feel like the most interesting parts are where you're kind of in between the two zones, and maybe that should have been like extrapolated more out of it.
Well, there you run the risk of overdoing it as well, right? Like if it's everywhere, and if it's the ubiquitous condition, then it's not special anymore. But yeah, I think I agree. It's right now it's still one of the more interesting spots.
In the animation, you leave out the floor slabs.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
I don't know. I think I was trying to paint how the form and the drape comes together, and I guess that adding the floor slabs and the truss system would have been clearer to like define the grid in the interior. You're right.
All right. Ashley, you were smiling when I asked the question. I mean, I think it ruins it. That's why you didn't show it, right? Like that, and you see it in parts of the plan, like and in, I think, the drawn section as well, that it overwhelms the delicacy of the grid, the frame on the interior, and you just get these really relentless floor plates that are stacked. And I don't know what to do with that, because the reality is you probably need that space. You probably need that square footage. So like, what do you like? It's better in your animation when it's just a giant shell and we're just seeing this kind of beautiful frame, and we're able to walk around through it. You'd have a lot more opportunities to do what Ashley's suggesting, of establishing these really amazing moments between the surface these surfaces and the frame, but then at the same time, you probably need some reliable square footage that you just have to be able to do whatever you need to do on. And I wonder if that just means you have to treat those slabs like another surface, and that they need to be able to do things beyond just be a slab. Like they need to blister, they need to bulge, they need to sag, they just have to find some set of behaviors that allow them to work as another member of this ensemble. Whereas right now they feel like they're just trying to be an extension of the structural logic or the structural frame, but the reality is like they're kind of messing that up in a way. And if you think about it conceptually, like it's probably a poured horizontal slab, and that's in a way no different than thinking about some of these other surfaces that would be assembled as surfaces, which is different than your linear elements. So like, I mean, in my mind, like that's the one missed opportunity in the project.
I think that I kind of struggled with this section in that way, because I struggled with like introducing another materiality to the kind of like binary of the really flat checkerboard and then the really textured fabric. And I think that I let that kind of just become just another way in which like the grid is reinforced through a very horizontal section in as far as the slabs go. And I think that like we tried to talk about the fabric coming into this section as like the way to disrupt the floor in a way that might have needed. But yeah, I agree.
I mean, I think
the difference, well, quickly, like I think the difference is that each other instance of the grid has a kind of material, like I think Grant called it behavior, and that's the one that doesn't. And we had quite a few conversations where we were like looking at sections of what the floor might look like with the, the metal, corrugated metal and the concrete topper and that kind of thing. And it does seem like perhaps being more aware of its materiality as a way of doing what Grant's asking for could be a way of extending that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the dichotomy shouldn't be elemental. It should be of a family, right? So I think you have surfaces that you're working with, and then I think you have linear assemblies, right? So things that you build out of columns and beams, and you have, I would argue, two of those systems. There's the larger box that we're seeing in this section, and then the smaller box at the back. And I think that if you think about that you have families that then have different members inside those families, like, yeah, it's still a dichotomy of surfaces and say a skeleton grid, but now you have a lot more flexibility in how you would relate those, or essentially assemble different members that have different characteristics or different behaviors that then could allow you to get outside of the problem of having to add something that you need, like a floor mat or a floor plate, and then all of a sudden be stuck saying, I don't know what to do with that.
I mean, this is not going to be a critical comment. I just want to say that I really like your project. It's kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like the floppiness of this kind of SpongeBob cloak. I really don't know. I don't have the proper vocabulary to talk about this, but yeah, the sponge. What do you call the thing that you wash dishes with?
Dish towel?
Dish
rag?
Dish rag?
Terry cloth? Yeah.
Yeah. There's something about the texture of what you're proposing. Unlike the first project where we were thinking about how to do the brick, I think, or how to produce a kind of maybe semi-postmodern simulacrum of a material articulation that's not there. Here, I feel like the stretch to proclaim that this surface will actually be the way it is, it seems really short. Meaning, I find it very plausible that I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be some kind of astroturf or some other kind of texture material, and perhaps there's even an environmental argument towards the second jacket in a place like Chicago. You never know. I mean, obviously, I'm just thinking about dead load. If you make this thing so absorbent, but at the same time, it could be super interesting that there's a component about the furriness that actually talks about denaturing the atmosphere on the inside, which I think is another Bob Sommel point. But and I also, I mean, Zach earlier mentioned Zachel's misregistration, right? I think there's something about the mismatch of the grids between the outside grid and the inside grid that also makes me think about a component of Zachel's work. Anyway, I'm a fan of this work. I just really like it, and I think the earlier questions about floor plates. That's really meaningful as part of. I mean, I'm thinking I like some of the moves that you introduced, right? Like these kinds of sectional dips or mounts on the interior, and I don't know. Like I'm not. Maybe there's another programmatic discussion to be had about what these kinds of extra textured landscape on the interior can do. I don't know yet what we can do with it, but as an exosuit story, I think it's really wonderful. I mean, I think today we haven't talked at all about the LADG, which is a group in Los Angeles. Do you guys know this group? You guys probably talked about it. In recent times, they've also worked on a lot of these kinds of drapery projects. Namely, there's one they built maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even 6, 7 years ago. I don't know. Time really flies. They did this thing at Materials and Applications where they forcibly constructed with waffle slabs exactly that project. And I say forcibly because this is kind of interesting. Coming back to earlier when Ashley was talking about bricks, and then I was talking about muds. This would be brick, I think. I think they came across a surface condition and they forcibly made it happen with precision, right? So it's not so much that they accidentally drape something. This is like really well calculated drape something. So I'm curious to think about yours in relation to that conversation, right? There's a kind of like accidental nature to the way that things are being draped, but then in contrast, there's a rigidity to the structural frame under this accidental drape. I'm curious about the path forward, right? Whether this becomes a kind of extremely precise replica of an accident or a calculated accident that becomes an accident, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we looked at that project early on, and I think I was toying a lot with if it should be rigid but appear a drape or not. And I think that in keeping it completely the terry cloth, I felt like it kind of merged with these sort of like two worlds that we were discussing the whole time, where there's some sort of like literalness in the real world of like constructing this with actual terry cloth, that I think like in the section on our desk or like when we were making the initial models was literal, and then leaving that as like kind of ambiguous in this other world. But yeah, I was thinking about that project again, like recently. And because we were talking about what this would actually be the other day, like what it would actually be constructed with when we were looking at the perspective from the underside of it. And yeah, I feel like I kind of avoided the like material consequence of it, but I think that like in this other world that we were talking about, it was like literal, and then possibly in this one it's literal, and possibly it's just extrapolated from this. I don't know.
Yeah, I think this question about production of this draped surface is really interesting, not only in the how you build it for the building, but how you produce it in the digital realm. Is it done with a kind of simulation of physics and cloth simulation and those sorts of things? Is it done with photogrammetry and then sort of translated into a model? Is it done by rebuilding surfaces? All these kind of different questions about how you might think about the surface being generated in the virtual realm and how that then informs those decisions about how you make it into a building. So maybe the counterpoint to LADG, taking that kind of ad hoc surface and then making it rigid with the CNC profiles, would be someone like David Eskenazi, where he's producing these forms and I think really bringing that instability of the surface into the intention of the proposal, whether it's the scaled paper house that was for the Woodbury Wedge Gallery, or the more recent work on, I think it's a bathhouse of some sort, where you get the sense that the building is actually going to move and wiggle and have these imperfections in reality. I would support that in your case. I think the notion of like this thing actually having flexibility and like blowing in the wind would be pretty amazing.
Yeah, I've been thinking about David's work a lot recently as well. Like I think that giant installation with giant in that, it's a piece of paper with grids and then he kind of like let it crumble. There's a way to harden that in its crumble state so that the calculated nature of how precise it is to construct it is at the mercy of the original material if it gets hardened once it gets crumbled accidentally, right? I think that's one way of doing it. Or then there's the contour cut, what have yous. It's like I think David's work is really interesting that way. There's the space for the physics to help us discover maybe aesthetics that we don't know yet or can't make. Right. This is the one I'm thinking about. Like, there's got to be a way to harden this in this particular state.
It's a perfect reference for your project.
Yeah, really good. Well, thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Great. I want to ask if there's like global comments, if you guys are up for sticking around for a couple more minutes. I mean, I do want to say that I really appreciate the energy and generosity of everyone and building this conversation today. Like, I'm fascinated by, as I mentioned before, this kind of discussion about material effects and material and I think it's really interesting that we're having that conversation in a world where the students wanted to make models and we were like, well, I was like, how do I get them to make models when they're not on an even playing field? And I was like, well, let's just use construction paper and things, and we'll just be really serious about these model making materials. And that kind of born a kind of attitude about making and then trusting the thing we made and then trying to deliver on those effects. And the conversation about physics, like we were talking about cartoon physics, Jimenez and other things, and then this conversation about simulacrum and literal materiality seems like a really logical extension of that, and is one that we weren't able to precisely hone in on. But if we were able to do a kind of space between midterm and final yet again, I definitely think that would be the seems to me like what a big takeaway would be from today's conversation. Are there any final thoughts from panelists or students?
Very beautiful work overall, because we probably forgot to say that on many projects that were beautiful. So yeah, I would just say congratulations and very great work.
Thank you
Yeah, I
guys
gotta
for
say,
coming.
oh, thank you. I was shocked when Ashley asked what year level it was, and Stuart said first year. I really didn't have that that knowledge, and I'm amazed not only in terms of the approach to representation, the development of the buildings, but the way in which you all seem tapped into the culture of architecture and the discipline. All the work felt very fresh and contemporary in terms of the ideas you were exploring. So I think for a first year, it's really impressive.
Yeah, no, I'm also really impressed, and thanks for the invite, Stuart. It's nice to come home. You know, it's nice to come home and look at what's happening. It's also nice to be with old friends. You know, like with Zach, I feel like Zach might have gone to the Jeffrey Kipnis School of Criticism, whereas Ashley might have gone to the John McMurrow School of Criticism. And so it's really nice to hear these sounds that I sort of know, and just it feels like a really lively conversation. And I was really admired, you know, all of your comments. And I think the state seems great. You know, like when I say state seems great, I remember a bunch of these older conversations that we used to have, and seeing it fast forward several years. It's nice to know that, you know, we're having much more advanced discussions about the status of resolutions, and you know, through materiality. I mean, especially through physical modeling. You know, is there a degree of loss of fidelity between the processes of, you know, capturing the material effects back onto the computer, or maybe in a different way? Are there ways in which we anticipate the loss of fidelity between precedent and design strategies, which I think it's a different type of resolution loss that seldom gets talked about. And I think the deliberate, let's say, withholding of precedent discussions, you know, to me seems like a really productive way to think about the word resolution today, especially in this studio. And echoing what Ashley said, I think we've always just took it for granted that things are beautiful. But things are beautiful. You know, every one of the projects are. You guys did such a good job. So if we forgot to say it, don't think for a second we didn't think it.
That's a good line. I like that. Just because we didn't say it doesn't mean we're thinking. No. Yeah, this was a lot of fun, guys. It was great to see the work again, and the progress made since the last time. Oh, when was the last time I saw it? Midterm or the open house? But either way, like it feels like I've seen it numerous times. That it's clearly continuing to advance and get better. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's true that, like, Stuart or Jim, I'm thinking of the Nortlings Read at Concert Hall reference, and you're like, that project lived in all of our heads for years inside UIC, and I like, it's clearly a part of this studio, and I think a lot of the other studios, but at the same time, it feels like this work is somewhere else, and in a good way. And I like all these conversations about materials and elements, whether those things are digital or simulated real things, I think are really amazing conversations to be having in your second semester as architecture students. And so, like, that's probably the thing I'm most excited about, beyond like how fun the work was to see and the quality of it. And it's great to meet you, Zach. It was wonderful to see you, Ashley, and Jim, as always. So yeah, good afternoon. Appreciate the time.
Thank you ever so much. I have not seen Zach or Ashley on a review before, so I was really excited to get you four into a single Zoom space, because like I admire all of your work so much, and was honestly really excited to see what you had to say about this stuff. And I'm very encouraged that you saw in it kind of what we saw in it too, and the conversations you guys are having were extensions of or like in the same world as the conversations we were having. You know, I think in this Zoom world, it's very easy to feel like, well, are we just kind of like doing this, you know, and having some conversation that's really irrelevant, disconnected, and not part of the zeitgeist. And I think that the conversation we had today was really helpful. And I think those, even though, and I guess I'm also really encouraged that sometimes it feels like when a studio evolves, that maybe you're losing sight of the beginning seeds of it. And I guess I see the conversation we just had about like, is the fabric fixed or not, is exactly the conversation extension at the beginning of authorship that we were having. Like, we read Death of the Author, we were like talking about like the role of, you know, the visitor versus us, and it feels like, even though we're talking about material decisions and like, it's still about authorship, and like, and I guess I'm really encouraged by that as well. And to just say that the students weren't allowed to use color last semester as just like as a bar of like difference with like how far people are coming very, very quickly, that can't be taken for granted. That you guys did a great job with that, and I applaud you all and really thank everyone for everyone's effort throughout the semester and today. Thank you so much. So thank you, jurors, for coming. I'd like to stick around with the students for a little bit, but I will release y'all if you want to go. Thank you so much. It was really amazing.
See you all
Thanks.
later.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
mate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Oh wait, are we on? We might be on YouTube, so maybe we should.
Live.
Says you're still alive.
So
Yeah, let's
I don't know
talk.
if we actually are. Let's reconvene on the normal link.
You
Okay.
can check how many viewers are watching right now.